It's a bright new sun that rises upon the military camp as the cook wakes everyone up for breakfast with the sound of his pan. The sleepy man started to wake up at the sound of clashing metal. His bed neighbor noticed that there was something hiding in one of his boots. The tattooed man freaked out and started to scream since a little bug invaded his shoe, which annoyed the blue-eyed man. Incrid was the name of the soldier with blue eyes. The tattooed man got out of bed and grabbed his axe while the redhead behind him was trying to fully wake up from his slumber. Another soldier with long white hair decided to start his day with an honest prayer. Incrid was the source of many problems, so he was appointed to lead these second-rate soldiers. One of the second-rate soldiers didn't even wake up to the obnoxious sound of the frying pan. Another one of the men, contrary to the first, woke up early, was fully dressed, and decided to sharpen his knife. In the evening, the horns of war were blown by the armored knights. With a bellowing roar, the commander ordered his soldiers to charge. Incrid was just a normal man with no powers or special abilities. Both armies of metal knights clashed together. Only hard work and perseverance earned my rank and place in the army, stated Incrid as he defended his life with his shield. The blue-eyed soldier managed to knock back his attacker with a kick in the gut. Suddenly, another enemy surprised him from the back and threw himself at him. Incrid thought that this was the end of the road for him as another man was on top of him with the intention of finishing him off with his bare hands. Luckily, one of Incrid's allies was able to decapitate the aggressor at the last moment. He thought that he had no skills as he tried to reach his sword. Incrid confessed that he couldn't achieve his dreams as he charged through the battle while protecting his head. Suddenly, an arrow flew in his direction. The panicked soldier miraculously avoided the arrow that ended the life of the man behind him as he thought of his hopes. Incrid was thinking about how everyone would try to take down his dreams and mock him. Yet, as he charged at the enemy, he hoped that his sword would mean something in his hand. As a blade was ready to strike his soul, the soldier revealed that his dream was to become a true knight. Incrid's dream was pierced by failure as a blade pierced the dreamer's neck. Life started to bleed out of the man. The sword was pulled out of the dying soldier's neck. Incrid was now on his knees beside the sword that was supposed to carry his hard work and dreams. In his last moment, the man started to pity his own death as it was pathetic. A mysterious blue flame appeared. Incrid's dying face was in front of a mysterious blue light. The dying man was in the middle of an infinite and peaceful water surface. Incrid's vision was starting to fade away. Something unexpected was going to happen to this random soldier. The man's essence started to fade on the mystic water. Suddenly, Incrid woke up shocked in his own bed and started to wonder if his death was a dream. The man next to him reached his boot to find something mysterious in it while Incrid reached out to his neck to check if the battle was just a dream. Suddenly, just like before, the tattooed man was startled to find a bug in his boot. Incrid quickly realized that he had already lived this morning but couldn't believe it. The soldier was once again fighting for his life on the battlefield. Incrid noticed a blade coming his way, but it was too late to dodge it or block it. Just like last time, the sword penetrated the man's neck for the second time. The third trial ended up like the first two, with the soldier's neck impaled by the enemy's sword. Incrid miserably lost once again at attempt number 4. The cook banged the pan and started to scream in order to wake the sleeping soldiers up once again. Incrid woke up feeling uneasy after dying so many times, thinking about that horrible pain caused by the blade in his neck as he coughed blood. Once again, the same battle repeated on this new day. Like every other time, Incrid was trying his best to make it out of the battle alive, thinking about this odd day. The cursed man's killer was spotted on the battlefield. With murderous intent, the throat stabber threw himself on the poor soldier as he realized that this was no dream and he was reliving the day of his death. Incrid was determined to turn his destiny around by murdering his killer and finally see tomorrow. A burning determination was flowing violently in the soldier's blue eyes as he struggled to live and defy fate to survive. Incrid was thinking about the killer's immaculate stab as he aimed for his neck. The cursed man has seen the tip of this murderous sword 17 times in a row. At the sight of imminent death, the man unconsciously closes his eyes. A second later, Incrid was stabbed by the exact same soldier in the exact same spot for the 17th time. His blue eyes burned with pain and determination as he started to cough blood. The man then relived his painful death one more time and started to regret all this time spent without his sword and all the efforts he never made. Incrid started to blame his constant deaths on his lack of hard work as the victorious man cleaned his sword and walked away. While drowning in his own blood, he assumed that not working hard enough was the reason for him dying again and again at the same blade. Incrid was once again lying down on this mysterious water surface. A blue flame contained in a lamp was modestly illuminating the infinite void as a mysterious voice asked the cursed man if that's what he actually believed about his own assumption. Incrid finally opened his cold eyes. The mysterious voice that asked him to keep struggling was a shady man on a small boat with a transparent cape and holding the blue flame. The mysterious entity claimed that the man's despair is a wall that he cannot pass and he should just give himself up to death. The defeated man was now on his knees thinking about the proposal. But Incrid's determination made him grit his teeth and gave him the courage to restart the battle. The cook was once again banging his pan, but the only difference is that this time the undead man was already awake. His subordinate sleeping next to him noticed that his commander woke up early today as he was wearing his shoes. Incrid informed Rem that the tattooed man of the bug in his boot. Curious, Rem decided to check the inside of his shoe. To his surprise, a bug fell right out of the boot. Rem immediately crushed the insect with his bare feet. Startled by this morning's surprise, the soldier asked the commander if he slipped the bug in as a joke, which the superior denied, claiming he just saw the insect crawling inside the shoe. Incrid took a good look at the dead bug on the floor. The commander claimed that he saw this dead insect a total of 18 times. Incrid started to wonder if he could escape his fate and see a new tomorrow if he died a few more times. The cursed soldier started swordsmanship at a very young age. There was a retired mercenary passing by that taught him the way of the blade. The student was praised by the teacher for his skills compared to his experience. Incrid began aiming to become a knight after hearing the mercenary say he has what it takes to become one. The boy began to fantasize about being a knight that takes out all the enemies and turns the tides of the battlefield. Incrid dreamed of becoming a great hero. His ambitions started to get to his head as he pictured himself as the one who will end the war, known as the Knight of the End and the hero of the great ballad. Incrid decided to leave his birth village and become a true knight. A bunch of drinking men started to talk about the rookie on their team. Incrid was called useless and got laughed at by the other mercenaries for dreaming of one day becoming a knight despite being scared of a simple stray dog. After entering the mercenary course, Incrid, who was treating his own wounds, realized that he had no particular talent or skill set. But the boy decided to keep going since it was only his first failure. And so the mercenary kept training and believed in his hard work. He kept on struggling as he hoped that time would uncover his potential. Incrid kept training for a long time as he believed in his efforts. According to the cursed man, these two assets would help him achieve his dreams. Incrid ferociously planted his sword in the head of the beast. He gained enough experience, strength, and endurance to be respected by the people around him. Incrid was getting stronger and firmly believed that his dream was in reach for him. But this dream was in danger as Incrid's sword flew out of his hands. The defeated man's hopes were starting to fade away when he was struck in the gut by a blade. Incrid was defeated by a young genius of the sword from the village he was staying in who wanted to duel the mercenary. The winner of the duel was just a 12-year-old who started swordsmanship 6 months ago and yet claimed that Incrid was a weak swordsman. Incrid was shocked by the fact that he lost to a child prodigy despite having trained so hard for so many years. The man was disappointed at how worthless all his hard work turned out to be. Anger filled the man as he started to feel despair. Incrid's dream is to become a knight. Even if people mocked him or laughed at him, he kept training. The dreamer decided to spend less time eating, resting, and sleeping. All he could think of was training with his sword as he swung it at a tree. A determined Incrid decided to put all his strength into the last swing. The dreamer swung his sword with all his might at the tree. The blade was trembling in the man's hand. Incrid was out of breath after this intensive training. The sun started to rise and shine in the sky. A tired Incrid decided to take a look at the tree's condition. The tree was barely scratched by the man's endless swinging session. Incrid stated that he had another path to follow if he couldn't become a knight. He grabbed once again his trembling sword with both of his hands. The dreamer was focused as he regained his stance. Incrid, despite being out of breath, came at the tree once again with a full power swing. The soldier hoped to become an expert soldier if he failed at becoming a knight. Incrid was struggling to keep up. He let out a wild scream, proof of his unyielding resolve and tenacity. Just like that, the mercenary continued to endlessly train until 3 years later, when everything changed. The Cyprus division was divided into the 4 companies, 4 platoons right above the 4 squads. Incrid, with his endless efforts, was able to become the commander of his second-rate squad, but he didn't complain since being a fixed soldier in a kingdom is better than being a mercenary. The cursed man had something to ask Jackson. Intrigued, the soldier asked his commander what he wanted. Incrid asked his subordinate to replace him on his morning patrol. Jackson gave a weird stare to the ex-mercenary. Finally, Jackson accepted, saying that Incrid owes him for this favor. Rem was annoyed at Jackson's wildcat behaviors and the way he stares at his commander. Incrid also had something to ask Rem, so the hairy man assumed that the commander would ask him to do one of his tasks. The time traveler got straight to the point and asked Rem to teach him the heart of the beast. The man with the axe was surprised at this sudden request. Rem asked Incrid if he was sure of this since he gave up the heart of the beast last time. The cursed man died once again in the Naliliev's Aspen close combat battle. Incrid started to think about how he relives the day of his death as the same sword pierces his neck. Rem was able to teach the heart of the beast to his commander. Yet even after acquiring a new skill, Incrid still can't see the blade aiming for his neck. But the man was determined to win this battle. The cursed soldier aimed to break his dying curse today once and for all as the army was getting ready for the battle. The brave men let out their war cry as they aimed for victory. This time, Incrid will relive the same day for the 21st time. A spearman was heading in the direction of the cursed man as he was about to end one of his companions. After reliving it for so long, Incrid was able to memorize the chaotic battle. Incrid swiftly dodges a spear aiming for his head just as he predicted. The next step was using the shield to block the surprise attack coming from behind. A tired Incrid takes a good look at the last step. The ex-mercenary had his eye on one of his companions in the squad named Vel. Even if Vel was giving his heart and soul to this battle, the man will meet death soon. Suddenly, an arrow was fired in the fire of the brawl. Incrid courageously jumps in front of the arrow with his shield to protect Vel, stating that his death is a part of the past. Vel tried to process the situation as an enemy was going to stab him in the back. Once again, Vel was saved by Incrid, who decapitated the enemy soldier at the last minute, which marked the time travelers achieving today's first goal. Only one problem remained for the Dreamer on the battlefield. Incrid's killer was there stabbing yet another soldier in the neck. The man pulls out his sword from the soon-to-be lifeless corpse. He then prepared to finish off his victim. Incrid always ends up fighting the man with a murderous look. After seeing the time traveler die by this man's blade 20 times, the killer heads for him, aiming to pierce his throat. But this time the cursed man was resolved to win. Incrid was determined to finally see tomorrow as the killer charges at the hero with a disturbing smile. According to Rem, the commander always closes his eyes when faced with danger. The hairy man suddenly grabbed his axe. Rem swung his weapon towards his superior's neck. Being scared of the axe, Incrid closed his eyes at the imminent danger, but according to Rem, this bad habit will eventually kill him. Rem told him to become a bold man who won't be shaken this easily by death. The tattooed man compared this state of mind to that of a wild beast. Back to the fight, the killer aimed his blade at the protagonist's throat one more time. But this time, Incrid was able to see the blade coming at his neck since he was able to learn the heart of the beast. After remembering his friend's words, the time traveler started to wonder if he himself was afraid of death. But shortly after, Incrid realized that he wasn't scared of death since it was his primary source of energy. Just as the blade was about to pierce his throat, Incrid was able to avoid it. The sword was just a few inches away from the man's precious throat. Incrid's heart started to beat wildly because of the adrenaline. Finally, the soldier was able to avoid the stab that killed him so many times. The cursed soldier was finally able to take a good look at his killer after 20 failed attempts to survive. The killer looked perplexed at the man who dodged his killer move. Incrid charged with everything he had at his opponent, who switched to a reverse grip on the sword. The blade was fast and was ready to strike like lightning. In an instant, the killer's blade was a hair away from Incrid's throat. It was too late for the time traveler to block or dodge the blade, so the stab was imminent. Just like that, Incrid found his neck pierced once again by the same sword. The cursed soldier couldn't believe how he fell for the same trick twice. He was once again back in the mystic waters, thinking about how he felt despair and pain reliving the day of his death repeatedly. The entity of the waters asked him to give up his dreams, get on the boat, and also accept his weakness since it will make him feel better. But Incrid refused the entity's proposal. With all his soul, the man refused to let his dream die. Incrid thinks about how he was able to finally see the tip of the sword that killed him as the cook wakes up the camp's soldiers. Incrid decided to take his training to the next level. The brave soldier decided to attack the same day for the 22nd time. This is the 33rd time that the two armies clashed together. Incrid was now perfectly able to see the blade that killed him. The time traveler barely dodged this fast strike. The protagonist was determined to finally survive this fight by dodging every lethal attack. Suddenly, the neck of the soldier was touched by Killer's blade. Incrid started to lose blood as he confessed that the enemy was just too fast for him. Once again, the time traveler was defeated and down on his knees. Incrid fell to the ground as his necklace was cut off by the blade. This goes back to his mercenary days. Incrid was running out of breath after being employed to take care of the monsters in the area. The man helped the villagers as they gave him a few tasks he wasn't obligated to do. The only reason the time traveler risked his life for these villagers was for him to achieve his dream of becoming a knight whose duty is to protect the weak. Since they were poor, the village folks had nothing much to offer as a reward, said the man as he put something in the mercenary's hand. Incrid took a good look at what he had received. The man received a mysterious charm from the villagers. According to the old man, this charm will realize the savior's most cherished wish, yet the man thinks that this reward was pathetic and not worthy of putting his life on the line. On his 22nd death, the man theorized that he's stuck in a time loop because of this charm and would only escape by realizing his biggest dream. The killer walks up to the victim, stating that he must feel terrible pain. After raising his sword to give the final blow, the killer stated that he will end the man's suffering. But Incrid knew that the final blow was far from mercy. The killer's eyes were filled with murderous intent. A creepy smile cracked on the man's face. For Incrid, the killer was just a sick person who enjoys stabbing people just like he was about to do now. The sound of the frying pan marked the start of a new day. In order to skip the monologue, Incrid claimed that he was the one to insert an insect that startled Rem in his boot. The hairy man was angry at such an unfunny joke and asked his commander if he finally lost his sanity. Incrid told Rem to drop the subject and meet him outside after making a firm step. With a resolved look in his eyes, Incrid asked Rem to teach him the heart of the beast. Rem was surprised by this unexpected request and change of behavior. Both men were now outside. Rem swung his dual axes with ferocity, but Incrid was determined to dodge them all and master the technique. To Rem's surprise, his squad commander perfectly dodged his attack without showing fear. This sudden feat piqued the hairy man's curiosity. Rem asked Incrid about this sudden burst of courage, who claimed that it's all due to his training, but Rem didn't believe him since this change of heart can't just occur overnight. Incrid trained for this technique more than 10 times now. According to Rem, there is no way someone could learn his family's secret techniques so quickly, and he was right since Incrid only mastered it through his many deaths. But Incrid wanted to avoid the topic and claimed that him learning the techniques so fast was just luck. The commander picked up a sword from the weaponry. Incrid took his stance and asked Rem if they could continue training a little more. Rem was still amazed at this odd, passionate behavior. With a smile on his face, he accepted the commander's request. Even if he mastered Rem's family technique, if Incrid can't land a decent blow, he would be doomed to restart this day. The commander swiftly dodged the axe barrage coming at him. The wild Rem asked Incrid if he was going to attack at some point. As he dodged the axes, Incrid thought of the only sword technique he mastered. The commander was getting tired of evading the axe blows. Incrid only mastered an odd sword technique named after its creator called the Valen mercenary sword technique. Only a few people criticized this technique by comparing it to a trick. As the beast threw itself at the commander, it claimed that the man needs more strength in his lower half. Incrid firmly planted his foot in the ground and prepared to use his best technique. At the sight of the stance, Rem felt alarmed. The killer's stab was coming his way. Incrid was trying to imitate the same stab that killed him so many times. But at the last moment, Rem knocked the blade out of his commander's hand. The sword started to spin in the air. Incrid couldn't believe what he just did. The commander tried to recreate the killer's stab. After being killed by it so many times, the stab was engraved in Incrid's muscle memory. Rem, surprised at such a move, stated that it could have gotten good. According to the hairy man, that stab was the best technique Incrid used today, but it lacked some impact. The commander stood there as his subordinate explained that his hand should have bled. Rem had a hard time explaining that his strike was clouded by doubts. The hairy man stated that if those flaws are fixed, this attack will be perfect, but Incrid wondered what would happen if it failed. Incrid should think that he will surely die if the stab is missed. According to Rem, this mentality will give him a better grip on his blade. Even if the subordinate didn't explain it well, the commander finally understood the true problem. After so long, Incrid understood the difference between his technique and the original. The commander's neck started to once again bleed out. The main issue was Incrid's lack of faith in his sword. Like every time, the killer decided to end the man's suffering. As the commander met death once again, he understood that he should pour murderous intent into his strike. A new day where Incrid trains was raised again. Like many times before, Rem knocked his superior's sword into the air. And just like many times before, Incrid died at the same blade. The commander died multiple times until now. Incrid was determined to progress no matter what it takes. Just as he died at the same sword, the cursed soldier was resolved to advance despite how slow his growth would get. On trial 111, Incrid met his end just like every other time before. Day 123 wasn't different from any other. At the end, the commander always found a blade in his throat. But the time traveler noticed that day 124 was different from the others while training. Rem put all his focus into this sparring session. Suddenly, the wild one stopped mid-fight. With all his soul, Incrid recreated his killer's favorite move. Rem was shocked by the commander's madness. His hands started to bleed. The time traveler's sword handle was getting soaked in his own blood from his hands, yet Rem couldn't help but notice him laughing like a maniac. A mad smile covered the soldier's face since he finally mastered his killer's deadly move. Incrid charged at his killer with more speed and killing intention like never before. The stabber also prepared his most iconic move. The time traveler gritted his teeth and went for the famous stab. Unfortunately, the strike slipped right off the helmet, missing the main body. Only the killer succeeded in stabbing his opponent. The first time Incrid decided to go stab for stab resulted in complete failure, but the squad commander was determined to the point where he wouldn't blink. Even in his last breath, Incrid still held on to his weapon. Incrid, who was under the killer's boot, started to think about everything he went through in this never-ending day. The creepy killer stated that his opponent must be suffering a lot. Incrid was going to be killed by the same blade wielder who claimed that death would be his mercy. The time traveler mumbled something about tomorrow, which left the other one intrigued. With a cold, hateful look in his eyes, Incrid assured that his killer would die tomorrow since now all the battle data are in his head. The killer smiled like the madman he is. Incrid was killed one more time by the one who claimed that no dead man would ever see tomorrow. The power of the charm activated for the 125th time. This time, the insect was immediately squashed by the commander. Incrid claimed that he found the bug crawling inside Rem's shoe, which left the man intrigued. The commander asked his subordinate to fulfill his duty as a guard. Rem was surprised since Incrid doesn't usually give such casual orders. This was day 125 of repeating the same day. The commander approached another of his subordinates that he called Big Eyes. Without looking at the man, Incrid asked Big Eyes to buy him a shield, some shin armor, and a dagger, saying that he would repay him later, which the redhead didn't like. Normally, Big Eyes wasn't much of a favor guy, but decided to make an exception this time for his commander while Rem was curious about those unusual orders. Out of nowhere, the man with the dagger called the squad members lazy and pointed out that they have always asked the commander to fulfill their tasks, which angered Rem. The tall, religious soldier who was followed by the sleepy members started to pray for his commander, while Rem couldn't help but notice his odd behavior. Incrid's eyes were never this filled with such resolve and dedication. The scarred tree was struck by a strong stab. Incrid started to think about the immense pain caused each time by death. The cursed soldier feared the worst if he never beats his killer, and started to wonder if he'd be able to make it to tomorrow if he just runs away. Incrid was now stronger than ever before, so he thinks that it's okay for him to take the easy way out. But the time traveler quickly rejected the idea of giving up. Resolve was glowing out of his blue eyes. Incrid was determined to beat the man who became an obstacle in his way. The commander finally learned his killer's stab. This move was endlessly practiced by the dreamer and always hit the same spot. Incrid put all of his strength into this one final strike. The cursed soldier's final strike was able to split the tree in half as he started to see his curse as a blessing in disguise. The blessed commander started to gear up for his grand battle with the items he requested from Big Eyes. Incrid finally finished wearing his gear. The blessed soldier was resolved to keep growing. Once again, the horns of battle were honked. And just like that, the second-rate squad headed for battle with their commander leading the way. The two metal armies clashed one more time. Despite his lack of talent, Incrid survived because of three crucial things, according to him. Chance, preparation, and a calm self were the commander's keys to survival, he thinks as he tackled an opponent with his shield. On his 46th death, Incrid lost his shoulder to a mace, and dodging it cost him his head the next day. The time traveler decapitated the mask to avoid such a fate. Incrid was now in the same situation he faced in Death 71 when a soldier cut off his foot, which made him powerless in front of the killer. This time he wore leg armor and kept both of his feet. The commander fiercely split the leg chopper's head in half. The next problem was a flying axe that ended Incrid's misery in Attempt 91, and even if not dead, its thrower was always a big problem, so killing him was the best option. Throughout his many resurrections, the commander mastered throwing weapons, so penetrating this guy's skull with a flying knife was no problem at all. Incrid eyed his companion Vel, who was fighting behind him. The blessed soldier used his shield to save Vel from an arrow fired by the claw of the hawks, since he had no time left to kill him. After taking care of the arrow, Incrid decapitated an enemy soldier who was coming after Vel. It was now time for the time traveler to face the stabber, who became a wall. The killer had just finished penetrating the throat of another soldier. His eyes were as bloody and creepy as ever. Yet Incrid's blue eyes were filled with focus and determination. The two men were about to repeat their never-ending battle once again. The merciless killer charged first. Incrid used his shield to block a lethal hit from this sword. The blow was so strong that it shattered the shield, so the commander charged without it after realizing that stabbing and dodging won't win him the fight. This time the commander used his sword as a shield to block the swing, stating that the killer was a normal soldier blessed with enormous strength, which made him look like a genius. The wall was surprised by this offensive bluff that turned into a defense. Incrid quickly realized that it's easy to surprise his killer since he lacks combat experience. Out of nowhere, the blessed soldier headbutted the wall in front of him. Given the circumstances, the Valen mercenary sword technique with its many forms would be the most effective against the killer. The soldier firmly implanted his foot in the ground and kicked the dirt. With his quick reflexes, the wall protected his eyes from the dirt. Incrid was getting ready to deal a deadly strike. But the killer's murderous eyes saw an open opportunity. The wall suddenly launched himself at the commander, aiming to stab him once again in the neck. But Incrid managed to dodge the attack at the last second by a few inches. The stabber missed his iconic strike, but the wall wasn't going to give up and went for another deadly stab. Incrid quickly noticed and recognized that trick. The one who died countless times at this stab finally knew everything about it. Incrid decided to go for a quick swing to counter the stab. Both swords clashed together one last time. In the end, the killer's sword was shattered into pieces. Suddenly, an archer fired his arrow into the battlefield. The killer was astonished by this unexpected defeat. Meanwhile, Incrid was getting ready to execute the wall with the same move that killed him in order to celebrate his victory. But the arrow fired earlier was heading straight towards the blessed soldier. Suddenly, a flying axe came out of nowhere. The flying weapon split the arrow in half, stopping it mid-trajectory. The killer was finally and ironically stabbed in the throat. Rem claimed that he would massacre the claw of the hawk, but his arrogant friend suggested dropping it since they ran out of time. After so many deaths, the stabber was stabbed in the neck. The wall was shocked at the ironic death that fate prepared for him. Meanwhile, every other soldier was doing his best to survive. The roles were now reversed as it was the perverted killer dying on his knees. The sun was finally shining on this cursed battle. Incrid was out of breath. He looked one more time at the man who just lost. The killer was agonizing and suffering from his injuries. With a cold look in his eyes, Incrid raised his sword to deliver the final blow. The commander decided to be ironic and called his next action mercy. Incrid was finally able to decapitate his killer. A mad smile cracked on the Time Ruinder's face. After so many attempts, he finally shattered the wall. Suddenly, Incrid was hit by a powerful blow. It was a humanoid monster that blew the soldier away with a simple kick. The kick was so strong that it made the time traveler scream in pain. Rem and the Dagger Man couldn't believe what they just saw. The creature looked strong and distinguished. A frog had entered the battlefield. Incrid was suffering on the ground after receiving a frog's kick. The beast exclaimed that he had a hard time believing Incrid killed a soldier he spent so much time training. After so many attempts, the shattered wall was finally headless. The time traveler grunted in pain on the ground. The frog raised its sword and decided to kill Incrid. Suddenly, an axe came in between the monster and the man. It was none other than Rem coming to rescue his boss. The beast swung his blade at the frog with full force, but the humanoid animal managed to block the swing of the axe. Both warriors were pouring their souls and minds into this battle. Each of the two fighters started to unleash and avoid a barrage of devastating attacks. Meanwhile, an enemy spearer decided to sneak in and finish off Incrid. Fortunately, the soldier lost his head to the Dagger Man at the last second. After the insane clash, both beasts tried to gain some distance from one another. They were both observing and analyzing each other. With a smile, Rem clarified that the frog would have to get through him if it wanted to kill his boss. The frog was surprised since Rem was Incrid's subordinate and not the other way around. According to Rem, his opponent could only be killed by using magic or a hit piercing his heart since he's from the fierce warrior race known as frogs. The humanoid frog wondered what a strong warrior like him was doing in such a puny and worthless battle and started to think of a way to eliminate him. As the monster saw Rem for the beast he truly is, he concluded that defeating him would require risking his own life. The frog decided that this fight wasn't worth putting his life on the line. The humanoid lost his battle stance, and just like that, the monster walked away from Rem. After that, the beast considered the frog to be a coward. Meanwhile, someone was running fast on the battlefield. The Dagger Man who was carrying his squad commander was about to be hit in the head by a mace. Rem quickly chopped off the enemy's head as the Dagger Man continued his escape. Another enemy came at the injured Incrid, but this time with a sword. Luckily, the religious giant came at the right moment and smashed the swordsman's head into the ground. The blonde sleepyhead was taking on many soldiers in order to open a path. All of the squad members regrouped to protect their commander and get him out of the battle safe and sound. Incrid was barely able to stay conscious due to his injuries. Finally, the troops were ordered to retreat. The Blessed One finally succumbed to fatigue and lost his consciousness. After so many deaths, the battle was finally over. A droplet interrupted the serenity of the mystic waters. A voice claimed that Incrid would only be able to withstand the first wall in his way. The boat entity assured the soldier that he wouldn't be able to surpass the upcoming obstacles. The mystic creature claimed that Incrid was to give up by succumbing to despair. But the man mocked the word fate. As Incrid started to slowly get up, he was able to picture his weak self on the other side of the wall. The soldier started to talk about the obstacles as he was now standing on his feet. With resolve in his eyes, Incrid affirmed that the walls exist only to be surpassed. The entity cracked a smile and confessed to the Blessed One that it will be waiting for the day those greedy eyes filled with ambition finally lose their fire. Incrid woke on a bed wrapped in bandages. From the looks of it, he was in a tent. The commander quickly assumed that he was in an infirmary tent. Rem, who was sitting on the bed next to him, stated that the boss slept for 2 days. The wild man reminded Incrid of how he saved him from the frog. A pain struck the time rewinder as he tried to get up, but was also amazed by the fact that he survived a frog attack. According to Rem, Incrid only suffers from a shaken head with no broken bones before stating that he's the commander's best friend. The Blessed One never said that he was friends with the noble hunter. Rem panicked and quickly covered up Incrid's mouth. The Wild One took a moment to make sure they were alone in the tent. Rem stated that Incrid doesn't have to yell his secret, even if it doesn't concern him, which intrigued the commander since Rem stated that he was his best friend. After dying more than 100 times, Incrid finally managed to see a new tomorrow. Crace, who was also known as Big Eyes, claimed that his boss should pay him back 3 times what he owes him since the place in the tent he paid for is pretty expensive. Incrid was confused until now since a regular soldier like him was in an infirmary tent and not healing his own wounds. The commander pointed out the fact that Crace was absent in battle as usual. Big Eyes pulled out a big smile and declared that the commander only owes him double the price of the tent. The sun began to settle down on the base. The Dagger Man of the squad named Jackson came to check on his superior. Incrid asked Jackson for the reason for his sudden visit. Without uttering a word, the assassin tossed something on the bed. It was a cream that Jackson mysteriously got, and the commander should use it in the morning and evening. Incrid was surprised since the ointment belonged to Jackson, who hates to share his belongings. Meanwhile, the religious giant Auden was praying in tears. The commander felt uncomfortable with the giant in tears on his knees praying for him. Incrid ordered Auden to get out of the tent since he's still alive and not dead. It was now evening. The squad commander wondered about his subordinates taking turns to take care of him, yet all this time they only did what they wanted. Incrid started to feel as if this second-rate squad actually cared about him. The sleepyhead entered the infirmary tent. The blonde man was intrigued by the sight of his superior. Ragnar was clueless and asked Incrid why he was in the tent. The sleepy one turned back and exited the tent. Incrid was sure that Ragnar didn't care about his injuries. The Blessed One shared the infirmary tent with 2 other injured soldiers. The first one was a platoon commander from another company that likes to fight with Incrid. Soldier number 2 was a stranger to the Time Ruinder and spent his time staring into the void. According to the commander, the young one looked like a low-ranked soldier, so it's weird to see him in the infirmary tent. Footsteps coming closer caught the commander's attention. The other 2 injured soldiers were also focused on the footsteps. An odd figure entered the tent. The woman was distinguished by her pointy ears. Her odd sword looked like it was forged by nature itself. The beautiful magical lady entered the infirmary tent. As soon as she entered the tent, the woman asked about the leader of the 444th squad. Incrid wondered why such a high-ranked pretty lady was searching for him. The 3 men were intrigued by the odd presence of the lady. The platoon commander had a hard time believing a fairy was in front of him. With a blank face, she asked him about his group, and so the man introduced himself as the commander of the 3rd platoon in the 2nd company, Vengeance. The fairy asked him if stating the race of the superior was something common in his company. Embarrassed, Vengeance apologized to the pretty lady. Incrid assumed that this fairy was the new commander of the 4th company. The Blessed One introduced himself as Incrid, the commander of the 444th squad she was looking for. The fairy wanted to meet the one who runs the squad of mischief and expressed her desire to work with him. Incrid was intrigued since she left after saying these few words. Suddenly, the woman asked someone to stop. The fairy looked at the young blonde man and asked for his name. Feeling unsure and uneasy, the blonde one called himself Krang. Incrid wondered if the man was a noble, judging by his shockingly bad behavior in front of a superior and the fact that he just lied about his name. The fairy took one last look at the time traveler. With that, the fairy exited the infirmary tent. Incrid wondered what was the purpose of such a high rank visiting him. A new day rises with dawn. Incrid was opening and closing his hand to test his body's reflexes. The soldier started to think about training since he was relieved of most of the pain and could finally manage some physical effort. Vengeance asked the Time Ruinder where he was going, to which he replied the training grounds. The platoon commander called Incrid an idiot for acting like a big shot despite his low rank. Meanwhile, Krang was just observing in silence. The sun was shining upon the blessed soldier's blade. Incrid decided to recreate the battle, a training method he spent a lot on in his youth. The man started to wonder what would have happened if he failed his last stab. Incrid decided to practice other skills and techniques since he would most likely die in case his only technique ever failed him. The man started to think about Rem's deadly swings, but just as he was about to think of a new move, his train of thought was cut by someone who noticed his hard work. It was Krang, who was curious about Incrid's odd training method and hand twitching back in the tent. The blue-eyed soldier explained that the twitching was to train his grip, while the spacing out was just him trying to simulate his previous battle. But Krang asked about the reason behind this training, to which Incrid replied that this training would help him survive. The blonde one asked the commander if this resolve to live was caused by a dream. Incrid hesitated at first since everyone who knew about his big dream mocked him. The small man looked at the sky as he thought about his gigantic life goal. As he thought about it, Incrid's grip on the sword tightened. The Blessed One raised his sword that reflected the light of the sun. Incrid took a leap of faith and confessed his dream of becoming a knight. Krang was amazed by this unexpected big dream. The Blessed One was intrigued by this blank reaction. He affirmed that it was the first time ever no one laughed at his dream. Krang said that he forgot to laugh before standing. As the blonde soldier walked away, he stated that he understood his role just by watching Incrid's training. It was the first time Incrid met someone like Krang. With a smile on his face, the young one asked his friend Incrid to remember him once he becomes a knight, which surprised him since he never got support for his dream. A new dawn has risen on the military camp. A musician was entertaining the crowd by singing about the hero's sacrifice. Vengeance started to complain in the morning about the delay of the breakfast and the food quality. Incrid decided to go on a morning walk instead of training after being woken up by the wandering minstrel and waiting for the late breakfast. On his way, the commander stumbled upon Jackson, who asked him about his injuries. The time traveler thanked his subordinate for the cream that helped his recovery. Jackson asked Incrid to show his gratitude by returning to the squad. The day ended and it was now nighttime. Krang wished Incrid a good night of sleep. Incrid, who usually slept early, wished him the same before closing his eyes and going to sleep. The third man told his roommates to shut up. The dreamer thinks he didn't do anything this day as he fell asleep. Suddenly, the wandering minstrel was chanting the glory of the hero's sacrifice outside the tent. Incrid, who just woke up, was intrigued since a wanderer doesn't come back to a place he's been before. The commander was annoyed by the loud Vengeance, who complained once again about the delayed breakfast. Suddenly, the time traveler understood it all. A shocked Incrid was unsure if his doubts were true. As he headed out of the tent, Jackson asked him about his injuries just like yesterday. Uneasy and startled, the commander confirmed that he's getting better. Jackson replied to Incrid with the same response as yesterday. There was no more room for doubt. The time window restarted the same day. The Blessed One remembered the boat entity challenging him to survive as the walls come after him. An astonished Incrid realized that he died in his sleep without noticing. Compared to last time, this death was more miserable than the last one. which made him feel pathetic. And yet the blessed soldier was more determined to surpass this new wall. A new challenge appeared on Incrid's way to knighthood. It was now nighttime, his death was coming close. Back at the tent, the three men were going to bed. Incrid started to wonder about this sudden death. The commander assumed that only an enemy knight could pass through all the defenses with such stealth. Since being attacked by a knight seemed unlikely, there must be an assassin undercover, and it is highly probable he is residing in the camp. The killer must be someone who knows the tent's location and how to mask their presence. While thinking about the assassin's description, only the fairy came to his mind. Only a swift, soundless fairy could pull off such a perfect assassination. Incrid theorized that his superior only came to the tent to know its location. But the man had to see her in order to confirm his doubts, and since the tent only has one entrance, Incrid could wake the soldiers up as soon as the fairy enters. All he had to do was stay awake until the killer showed up. Suddenly, a needle struck the man's neck. Incrid was hit by a poison needle. The soldier, who grunted in pain, didn't notice the assassin coming in. The pain was so intense that the time rewinder ended up falling from his bed and was completely paralyzed and unable to speak. Incrid was hit by a numbing poison inside the needle, which explains his sudden death last time. The platoon commander was unconscious due to the numbing needle in his throat. As for Krang, a shitty figure was standing above the sleeping man. Incrid struggled to move as he realized who that mysterious figure was. The man who killed him last time pulled out a sword to finish Krang off. A sneaky blade struck the blonde one in the heart. Krang died without having a chance to resist. Incrid's eyes were filled with hatred and rage as he looked at the assassin. Suddenly, a sword tore right through the cloth of the tent. A new caped figure appeared, so Incrid assumed that it was another assassin. The tactical commander took a good look at the other intruder. Pointy ears could be distinguished under the red hood. The intruder had a wooden sword as if the weapon was forged by nature itself. Incrid's fear came true since the woman's appearance confirmed his doubts. The fairy was involved in his murder. Once again, the same morning rises in the military camp. The wandering musician was singing the prowess of Cyprus outside again. Incrid was now repeating the day for the third time. The blessed soldier realized that the task would be difficult since he couldn't spot the killer despite his best effort. But the assassin wasn't the biggest problem if the fairy was involved in the assassination. Incrid started to feel hopeless and desperate, but this helplessness didn't feel alien to the commander. The same despair struck him when facing the throat stabber. But in the end, it was the dreamer who decapitated the wall. Incrid was certain that he will be victorious if he doesn't lose hope. Suddenly, the chosen one pulled the blankets off one of the beds. Vengeance, who happened to be sleeping on this bed, asked Incrid if he had gone mad. The angry platoon commander asked Incrid if his training consisted of killing cockroaches with a sword, while the man decided to inspect the outside since the killer hadn't infiltrated the tent yet. With a smug look on his face, Vengeance claimed that hunting insects was the best-suited training for Incrid's low rank. The Time Rewinder thanked the platoon commander for caring about him, but Vengeance denied it, pointing out the sarcasm in his claim. But what Vengeance, who screamed at Incrid to get out of the tent, failed to understand was that the man was also showing sarcasm. The third resident of the tent asked the two commanders if they were quarreling once again. Feeling how awkward the moment was, Krang tried to leave the scene. But Incrid told him to come, which annoyed the platoon commander. The blessed soldier concluded that since the killers only made sure that Krang was dead, he must be the target they came to eliminate. But Incrid wasn't willing to ask someone who wouldn't talk unless questioned about the matter. This situation reminded the commander of his crazy squad members. But since his presence in the tent got Incrid killed, he decided to question the blonde one. With a blank expression, Incrid asked Krang who he really was. The young one was surprised by the sudden question. Incrid wondered if his communication skills became dull after hanging out with Rem since the question came out wrong. Krang hesitated in revealing the whole truth. The blonde soldier decided not to reveal his identity. When asked why he couldn't, Krang just said that it was a long story. Incrid paused for a second to analyze the conversation. In the end, the Time Rewinder dropped the subject, which shocked the platoon commander. Vengeance started to scream at Incrid since he was satisfied with such a shady answer after asking such a clear and straight question. In his burst of anger, Vengeance pointed out that Krang was a foreigner considering his bad manners and accused him of being an enemy spy. After hearing the accusation, the expression on the young one's face drastically changed. The platoon commander started to shiver after getting such a cold and intense look. The mystery man took a few steps forward. Vengeance wondered what the blonde soldier would do next. With a calm and confident smile, Krang assured them that he would never betray this country. Incrid could feel something coming from Krang's movement and eyes. The mystery man gave Incrid the impression of a knight. An embarrassed Vengeance tried to flip the situation by pointing out his higher rank, which made the pseudo-knight laugh. Since Krang was easily assassinated by the killers, Incrid was sure that this man was no knight. Even so, the mystery man was still suspicious according to the 4th squad commander. Night had fallen. The killing would soon begin as Krang said his goodnights. This time, Vengeance abstained from the usual hurtful comment. Incrid wondered if the attitude change was due to him being scared of the mystery man. The ex-mercenary was on his guard. All of the tent residents would die when the assassins used the main entrance. Incrid decided to get out of bed, which piqued Vengeance's curiosity. The platoon commander asked his roommate why he was still awake. Incrid asked the two men for help since assassins would soon come after them. Vengeance was astonished by this claim. The platoon commander went back to sleep after calling Incrid a madman. Krang didn't care about the proclamation and went to sleep anyway. Incrid wasn't surprised by their reaction, but his train of thought was cut short by an astonished voice from outside. The soldier immediately realized that this voice belonged to the assassin. But before he could react, a poison needle tore the cloth of the tent and pierced his throat. The dead man couldn't figure out the moment of the strike. After that, the assassin went for a needle in Vengeance's sword. As for Krang, his heart was once again pierced by the blade. The astonished soldier died once again in this tent. Incrid was awakened by the Ballad of Cyprus for the 4th time and concluded that his roommates wouldn't help him since there is no proof of the assassin. The blessed soldier decided to seek the help of his superiors, but no one believed him. Incrid decided to predict the exact moment of the assassination and stop it by screaming. The commander had a hard time predicting the assassination. Anxiety began to rise as the time got closer. But just before Incrid could scream, the assassin silenced him by piercing his neck. The blessed one started to bleed to death. Incrid complained that the killers were too fast for him as they went to finish their mission. It was now the second attempt, and since no one would help him, he had to ambush them alone. Suddenly, a poison needle was thrown. Incrid's throat was struck once again as he wondered how he would be able to kill what he couldn't see. The wall, who was behind the time ruinder, had a clear view of the surroundings while he couldn't even spot them. Incrid was taken out by the poison needle once again. He knew he would be powerless as long as he couldn't see the enemy's projectiles. The new day started by chanting Cyprus's feats once again. Incrid pitied his weakness as he died 20 times. The man started to panic when he realized that he failed 20 times in a row. The soldier was starting to get desperate. Suddenly, a smile cracked on Incrid's face. The madman felt motivated since he was only killed 20 times. Incrid had someone in mind that would help him avoid the needles. The commander approached Jackson since he could teach him how to get faster than the assassin. Incrid was about to ask his commander for help. The commander remembered asking Rem for the reason Jackson was a perverted wildcat. According to the noble hunter, that's all the dagger man was. Just like a pervert, Jackson backstabbed and retreated without engaging in direct fights. This fighting style reminded Rem of a wild cat. Jackson was intrigued by the presence of his commander. Incrid was certain that the assassins would lose against Jackson. The commander wasn't able to and didn't want to take his subordinate to fight the killers. This was a challenge the Blessed One had to face alone. Incrid decided to become more like the Dagger Man. The commander directly asked the wildcat how to survive an ambush made by someone as skilled as him. Jackson paused for a second and thought about it. The Dagger Man was unsure of what to say since his surprise attacks never failed. Incrid was startled after hearing such a scary claim. The commander looked with disappointment at his subordinate. Jackson could read the determination in Incrid, who didn't believe such a claim. The Dagger Man let out a big sigh, meaning he would reveal the secret. According to Jackson, one could only survive by knowing everything that happens around you. Incrid didn't understand what he meant. Jackson told the Time Ruinder to look at the wagon, which he couldn't find. Incrid was amazed since the wildcat noticed something this far away and started to wonder if Jackson really had eyes on the back of his head. Confident, the Dagger Man claimed that the wagon would soon crumble. Suddenly, the far wagon lost one of its wheels. Incrid was amazed by this feat. Confused, the commander asked his subordinate if he could see the future, which he denied and told him that he sounded just like Rem, but Incrid wanted a straight answer. Jackson claimed that the secret was hearing. The wildcat predicted the wagon after hearing the creaking of the wheel. Jackson affirmed that to anticipate what happens next, one has to hear what's around him first. Incrid was amazed by Jackson, who heard such a quiet sound while he didn't even notice it, while the subordinate affirmed that that sight wasn't necessary to analyze the surroundings. The squad members suggested starting a train by isolating the different sounds around them. Incrid claimed that Jackson explained properly despite being lazy, which he confirmed. The Dagger Man explained that it's better to give his commander what he wants so he won't become clingy. Jackson felt that Incrid recently became more determined than ever. Night had fallen and the killing would soon begin. The blessed soldier was lying on his bed thinking about the second obstacle. The new wall was a faceless assassin. Survival was only possible by locating the killer. Incrid focused on the nearby sounds. He could notice the regular footsteps of patrols. The crackling of the torches was also heard by the soldier. The faceless assassin arrived at the camp. Incrid was focused on locating any unusual sounds. The swift killer silently landed on the ground. The time traveler couldn't locate the assassin by sound. Suddenly, the enemy was nowhere to be seen. A poison needle pierced the man's throat one more time, but he wasn't surprised by his failure. Incrid restarted the same day, yet didn't progress a bit, but everything was engraved in the man's muscle memory. Incrid remembers how he learned the stab in the heart of the beast clearly. Jackson explained that he could use sound intensity and direction to perfectly locate his target. According to the Dagger Man, once Incrid can hear the weakest sounds, his ears will become the eyes on the back of his head. Suddenly, the expert snapped his fingers. Jackson explained that sound, no matter how weak it is, spreads everywhere like a wave and that the surroundings are chaos made by thousands of those sounds. All Incrid had to do was find the one wave he needed. In the camp, a soldier talked about someone he killed and two others conversed about the beauty of the town while another bunch were talking about a cheater. Incrid was sitting there, eyes closed, trying to isolate and identify the different sounds. The soldier couldn't tell how many flags there were since they all sounded like one. Incrid could tell that there were 3 soldiers close to him and 2 far away. The man tried to recognize and filter any familiar sound. He tried his best to detect the alien sounds. The training was interrupted when Krang approached him and called him NC. The young one asked about the man's weird training, but Incrid was more concerned about the name NC. Krang stated that he would surname the commander NC, which he didn't like, but also didn't mind. Incrid stated that this was no training since he was just sitting like a fool. The mystery man smiled and affirmed that NC was not the type to waste his time. Incrid was impressed by the soldier's sharpness. That night, the poison needle was once again thrown. The commander died in his bed. Incrid was once again paralyzed and powerless in front of the wall. The assassin killed his blonde target with a sword in the heart. The wall killed the young one many times. Krang ended up dead every day. Incrid was enraged by failure number 33. It was now day 34. The Blessed One was unable to hear the assassin coming. Krang died once again, and Incrid kept collecting failures. During the day, the protagonist trained his ears. To beat the assassin, no further experience was needed. Miracles and sudden realizations were also not required to win. As a small bird flew behind him, Incrid thought that he only needed to repeat one thing. The little bird landed on top of the flagpole. This bird didn't make any sound as it landed. The wall's landing was just as stealthy as the flying creature. Suddenly, the man opened his eyes. He found himself face to face with Krang. The mystery man was surprised and explained that he tried to sneak up on Incrid but failed miserably. Krang guessed that Incrid was training his senses since he had his eyes closed. The commander suddenly remembered how the mystery man guessed that he does not waste time and was surprised by how easily he was read by that man. That night, the killer started to throw his poisonous needles. To the wall's surprise, the dreamer moved his head and dodged the needle by an inch. Incrid quickly pulled out his weapon from under the sheets. The startled assassin barely managed to evade this sudden swing. Shocked and surprised, the killer wondered how the soldier countered his ambush. Everything went too fast for the panicked assassin. The madman cracked a smile after finally seeing his killer's face. The assassin became irritated by this failure. Incrid dodged the blade of the man who called him a rat. This wall wasn't as combat-oriented as the last one, so it shouldn't be a problem for the time traveler to take him on. Incrid decided to make a quick look to check on the others. Vengeance was struck with a poisonous needle while Krang still hadn't pulled out his sword. The tricky killer was focusing on ending the blessed soldier, so Incrid must also focus on the fight. The man barely dodged the experienced assassin's stabs. Suddenly, a second knife was thrown by this wall. The blade didn't hit his head, but was still able to cut his chest. Incrid had no other choice but to take a few steps back. Suddenly, a blade tore through the fabric of the tent. Incrid felt alarmed when this new figure entered the tent. The company leader had entered the scene. Incrid, who assumed that the fairy was an enemy, decided to take the first strike. Ignoring the assassin and in order to guarantee his own survival, the Time Rewinder launched himself at his superior. The enraged killer assumed that the fairy was the target's guard and launched a rain of poisonous needles. Incrid barely avoided all those needles flying across the room. Krang started to panic as the deadly projectiles were coming his way. NC had no time to save his friends from the needles. Suddenly, the woman in front of him jumped over the dashing soldier in the blink of an eye. Needles were starting to get stuck in the red cape. The company leader used her cape to shield the mystery man from the needles of death. After all this time, Incrid realized that his superior was no enemy since she came here to save them. The time traveler decided to take advantage of the confusion. In the blink of an eye, Incrid launched himself at the assassin dagger first. The wall decided to slice the soldier first. At the last moment, the Blessed One aimed for the knife instead of his holder, which made it fly off his hand. The tricky killer realized that his mission was a complete failure. In the blink of an eye, the wall headed for the exit. The assassin disappeared into the night after exiting the tent. This sudden escape pissed off the main character. Krang stated that he was most likely the assassin's main target, which NC confirmed. Intrigued, the mystery man asked Incrid how he figured it out. Both the 4th squad commander and the platoon commanders were nobodies, so it's highly unlikely someone put money on the line to have them killed, which the fairy confirmed. The company leader grabbed her blade and complimented Incrid on his quick life-saving reflexes. Until this moment, the fairy turned out to be an ally, but it was obvious she would try to silence the time traveler. Incrid tightened his grip on the dagger as he realized that the fairy would kill all the witnesses. Suddenly, Krang stood between the 4th squad commander and his superior. The mystery man looked at the fairy and asked her for a favor. Krang wished for today's bloodshed to finally stop. Intrigued, Incrid quietly watched this situation's outcome. The company leader bowed respectfully and agreed to grant the mystery man this favor. Krang asked if it was too late to save vengeance, but the fairy assured him that the antidote would save the man. The fourth squad commander assumed that his superior was knowledgeable when it came to medicines. The blonde one stated that they should get rid of any evidence since the news of the assassination attempt would become a problem if it ever became public. NC asked if getting rid of the material proof was enough. The madman looked at the candle on the table and claimed that there was an easy solution to their problem. The infirmary tent was set on fire. Every soldier in the camp rushed to the tent carrying water to put out the fire. The two survivors, Incrid and the unconscious Vengeance, were spotted by the soldiers. The Blessed One thought the fire should be enough to get rid of any evidence of the assassin, and now the soldiers would put out the fire, leaving nothing to fate. Meanwhile, in the woods, the company leader pointed out that if not for the squad commander, Krang would have died tonight. The mystery man had changed his decision because of his friend Ensi. Krang found the time traveler interesting, which intrigued the ferry commander. The man looked at the sky, thinking about how he tried to avoid his destiny. Krang then remembered the hard-working dreamer. Thinking about his friend put a smile on the mystery man's face. Krang confessed that Incrid made a huge impact on him. As he headed to his destination, the blonde one wished to meet this friend again in his respective position. A death scythe was standing on the surface of the mystic waters. The weapon started to fade away. The Blessed One was once again alone in the mystic waters with the boat entity. The mystic being assured the man that he would meet Krang again. Incrid expressed that he was looking forward to this reunion. It was now morning at the military camp. After dying so many times to the assassin, the Blessed One was finally able to see a new day. Incrid started to think about the many responsibilities that awaited him once home and how he couldn't even sense his superior's presence that night. Since the commander wasn't hurt, he could return to his squad immediately. But just as he was about to head out, someone asked him why he rescued him from the fire. The platoon commander wondered why the Blessed One saved him. Incrid couldn't believe Vengeance was showing ungratefulness after everything he did for him and never understood what he had against him. The soldier affirmed to the bully that he only saved him because they both share the position of commander. After hearing this response, the platoon commander sat there in silence. Vengeance started to mumble about how selfless the one he bullied was. The platoon commander asked his savior if he was going back to his squad, which he confirmed. But Vengeance affirmed that Incrid was unlucky since the atmosphere was full of stress, which intrigued the Time Rewinder. According to some rumors, there was a curse on the military base. An angry Ragnar insulted someone by calling him a monkey. The sleepyhead was picking a fight with Rem. The noble hunter angrily smiled at Ragnar, provoking him. Scared for their lives, the nearby soldiers started to run from the members of the mad squad fighting among themselves and wondered where Incrid, who usually stops them, was. Ragnar was thrown into one of the tents, destroying in the process, but its inhabitants were too scared to stop them. The sleepy one smacked the barbarian with a punch in the face. Rem responded with an even stronger punch in the face. The angry barbarian pulled out his axes, stating that he would use them to split Ragnar's skull, which terrified the other soldiers. Filled with anger, the lazy boy decided to cut the noble hunter as he pulled out his sword, while the soldiers wondered where the other members of the squad who should be stopping them were. Incrid wasn't sure if there was a curse upon the base, but the commander was sure and certain that his squad was definitely one cast upon him. The commander, who might go mad because of them, ordered the fight to stop, and while Rem was surprised by his arrival, Ragnar expressed his surprise to find an alive Incrid coming home. 4 days have passed since the assassin's incident. Incrid is still sleeping in his bed. Incrid struggled to get back on his feet. The time traveler noticed that he's a different man now. Now Incrid can keep on advancing since he can repeat the same day many times, and with a burning confidence on his face, the man promised Rem to defeat him this time. The noble barbarian paused for a moment and thought that the commander lacked skills. Incrid's eyes were filled with passion and determination. This look burning inside the commander's eyes made Rem want to spar with him more. A smirk formed on the noble hunter's face as he claimed that the Blessed One should first try to scratch him. Suddenly, the cloudy sky started to rain. Due to the bad weather, the two men had to stop their sparring session. Given the circumstances, they returned to the cabin to seek shelter from the rain that had begun to fall. He observes the rain falling outside. That random event happened in its own way without warning, lasting as long as it wanted. One of them complains that if the humidity continues like this, there won't be much he can do for his feet, which will develop fungus. As it was already night, some slept while others prepared to do so, saying prayers. Red Hair says that the rain is a great nuisance that prevents him from continuing his duels when they happen. He even comments that he would completely believe it if someone said they were cursed. The squad leader was curious and asked more about the matter, and the other guy responded about what they were discussing there. Recluse in his thoughts, he realizes that Vengeance was talking about something similar. However, he was categorical. He claimed that the camp had been cursed. Red Hair said that the succession of misfortunes that had befallen them, injuries, fire, the incessant rain, all contributed to the belief in the curse. He doesn't entirely believe it because he knows there's no control over the weather and that its unpredictability is what fuels the rumors. The leader says that the superiors wouldn't let something like this pass without reacting to it. Red Hair wants to know why the leader is standing at the cabin entrance, and he says he's training his senses at that moment. He just didn't understand why he was doing that during the rain, but it was exactly because of the rain that he was training. The barbarian didn't understand that unorthodox training either, but the one who was reading said that it wasn't a bad way to train. The barbarian looked at him immediately after hearing those words because he thinks they're teaching nonsense to their leader. Meanwhile, the leader laments that the noise of the discussion prevents him from hearing the sound of the rain hitting the ground. Another one says that if he wants to train, there are other ways to do so while they're sheltered. He suggested he could check his posture. The barbarian realized that everyone there had already noticed. The avid reader was also watching, as was the gray-haired guy in the group. The blonde with a modern haircut had also noticed. It seems they're all on the same page, the barbarian thinks. And the leader is at the tent entrance, focused. Someone gives the order for the company commanders to keep the soldiers under control, because they need to send an escort group eventually and would like to hear suggestions on how to fill the gaps. The elf suggests the leader of the 44th squad, to which the man responds that this individual lacks cognitive ability and could hinder the scout's progress. However, she says that he could bring an unexpected result, and now he wants to know what makes her believe that. Not finding better words to describe her belief, she says it's the instinct of a fairy that makes her believe so. Dawn breaks at the camp, the sun lights up the sky, and there's no more rain falling. The squad leader is now in front of the fairy, introducing himself to her. He's asking if he's indeed being sent to the scout group. Back in his tent, Red Hair asks if the chief had angered the company commander. However, there was nothing he had done to justify this. Still, for Red Hair, that was the only thing that would have made them be chosen. With Krang's departure, he thinks that the fairy wouldn't eliminate him, not now. Thinking about this matter left him intrigued about the possibilities. The barbarian asks if he's really going with the scouts, and even said that if he wished, he could help him get out of that complicated situation. The leader says he wouldn't use an axe against a superior like the barbarian would, who, though crestfallen, said that he looked like the kind of person who would do that. Religious tremble and prays, asking God not to take their leader from them, and seeing the concern, he wonders what goes through these guys' minds. The blonde with the modern haircut gets up from his bed and volunteers to go in place of their leader, who replied that he would accept another, but not him. The others say he would get lost along the way. The scholar asked if the superiors had sent him to investigate the tall grass. He advised him to pay attention to sounds and possible disturbances. Any break in pattern is a sign that an ambush is underway. The barbarian was upset upon hearing this because he thinks all this teaching is completely useless. The leader is worried about leaving the brutality crew alone because without him there, violence among them is guaranteed. Even so, he agrees that there is no one better than him to accompany the scout group. When he enlisted, his lack of skills made him frequently transferred. Only one place in his entire career revealed his potential. Meanwhile, the barbarian advances towards the scholar, who, on the other hand, already has his dagger in hand. His leader takes his step towards the epicenter of the conflict. Both brutes immediately widen their eyes, because the leader was in the middle of them, and if they were to attack each other there, they could accidentally eliminate him. He asked them to call a truce on the violence. This was the place of his maximum potential as the leader of a shadow squad. Barbarian, with a bit more patience, asked if the leader was brave or just stupid for doing that. The scholar says he should be grateful. If it weren't for that, he'd have another hole in his chest, but he says he would have divorced his head from his body first. The leader acknowledges the usefulness of all of them and that he is far from representing an advantage. Losing any of them would be much worse. As night falls, he continues thinking about this but recognizes that he should avoid the subject. After all, he is aware of his abilities as a warrior, and the only thing he needs is to keep improving. Taking advantage of the fact that they are heading to the front lines, he will be able to perfect and refine his senses. An anonymous person asks the leader of the Shadow Squad to stay more focused. That is the leader of the Scout Squad who, despite having the same rank, was the leader of the current group. An anonymous person said he doesn't have the guts to question the Scout leader, to which another adds that he probably doesn't even know how to hold a sword. He continued the insults, saying that he was useless in a squad of useless people. After the session of insults, he told his team that if they encountered enemies, they would smash their skulls. That shouting made Incrid wonder if this mission would end well because they should be more discreet. One of them finds tracks on the ground and calls his boss to analyze them. He leans over the footprints and recognizes them as antelope. They're probably wildebeests. Now he wants to follow that trail so they have something to eat that night. Incrid is astonished by his foolishness, wanting to hunt a wildebeest when this animal usually moves in reasonably large groups. The archer who was with them said that those tracks were of gazelles. He noticed that Incrid had heard him and looked at him. He even commented that the leader was too old-fashioned. This man is Henry. Before becoming a soldier, he was a hunter in a mountainous town. He wasn't on the scout leader's side and soon made friends with Incrid. He taught Incrid the basics of being a hunter and said he would talk more about it the next day. At nightfall, someone complains energetically. The inept leader made them follow a trail of animals they never found, wasting an entire day of the mission. Now he's anxious because he needs results, even if minimal. Dawn breaks at the makeshift camp after a frustrating day. The soldiers prepare, ready to continue their march. Amidst the tall grass, the inept leader says they finally arrived. That is the place where they should conduct reconnaissance, popularly known as the useless tall grass field. Besides being an extensive plain, the grass was really tall there. The inept leader says that now they will cross that field and capture the enemy scouts to be rewarded when they return. Entering the dense vegetation, Henry asks if they should really do that because he thought the reconnaissance was only supposed to go to the edge of that place. Encrid says the inept leader's command was to advance. They proceed in formation. The advance is not easy, and Encrid thought the inept leader would give up soon. That was unexpected for him. The inept leader is engaged in his duty, and besides not complaining, he's quite focused. The archer comments that there is no animal droppings there, to which Encrid asks if that is bad. He responds that they are in a place with abundant food, but it's not frequented by animals. Near them, the furry paws of an animal touch the ground. It steps firmly on the ground, making a discreet noise. That was more than enough to make Encrid immediately heighten his awareness. The beast was passing by him, ready to attack. His eyes follow the feline's movement. The animal looks back at him as if it knows someone there has noticed it immediately. Reacting quickly, he yells for everyone there to get down immediately. Arrows whiz through the air and 2 heads are struck by them. The inept leader finally realizes what was happening to them. They are the enemies, and they had found them first. His next order is for everyone to run and escape the imminent attack. During the ambush, some are captured, including the inept leader. Henry is also eliminated by him, and Encrid is almost caught by the attackers. Racing through the dense vegetation, he is strategically surrounded. Despite the disadvantage in the chase, Encrid continues his relentless path. A crossbow is reloaded and aimed at its fleeing target. Encrid managed to hear that sound. Jackson's technique was proving to be really useful. The fired arrow heads in his direction, but he manages to dodge it. He remains anxious about the situation because he is an easy target. The excessive noise makes him unable to focus on just one thing or distinguish all the information. Several arrows are now nearly reaching him, and there's not much that can be done. His body is immediately pierced by most of them. Encrid was in shock and thinks that when one knows about an ambush, the right thing to do is to take measures to avoid it. Inepto asks him to repeat what he said. Unfortunately, Encrid knows he won't be heard and will have to find a way to handle everything alone. During the twilight, the ambush happens once again and the scouts try to escape from it. He attempted a different escape route this time, but the enemies managed to surround him just the same. Even though crossbows are being fired, everything was fine. The repetition of that event favored Encrid's growth. Once again, his body is pierced by arrows from the crossbowmen as he tried to flee east of his position. To the north, the arrows weren't there, but a platoon of spearmen found him. He was slowly fading from his wounds. Even though he avoided them all, he was still followed and found. The ambushers' uniforms blended with the vegetation as they were painted green. Now he imagines there must be something in that field for it to be so well protected. The light of a campfire illuminates the camp. A banner is raised, stained with blood. Encrid lies on the ground, gravely wounded. His ambusher finishes the execution by striking him in the neck. As the events repeated, his curiosity grew about what was being hidden in that field. Ineptor says once again that they will cross that field and capture enemies. That had already been attempted dozens of times, and every time they entered, they never came out. Now he is sure something is hidden there. He just needs to know what it is. If he gave up on it, he wouldn't need to be eliminated, and that day would finally end. But that daydream soon leaves his mind. Now he was resolute about overcoming this obstacle that life had presented to him. Inepto calls his attention, ordering him to follow quickly. One of the soldiers approaches him and asks for patience, saying that Inepto has his problems too. Encrid says there's a limit to listening to nonsense, and he's already fed up with that man-child's behavior. The soldier didn't like what he heard from his leader. Encrid says he won't play this game anymore, and he heads towards Inepto, who imagines his authority is being questioned. He needs to think carefully about his actions because without the support of the others, he won't manage either. He told the current leader that from now on, he would be giving the orders. Inepto was furious at the insubordination, but both he and Henry are the ones who survived the longest. The soldiers observe what's happening right in front of their eyes. The veteran soldier sticks close to the leader as if he were his personal babysitter. Despite the insubordination, Inepto agrees to the apparent challenge as long as he is defeated in a duel. A soldier doesn't need a bodyguard, and looking at his posture, he knows he is well trained. He certainly must come from an influential or wealthy family, which would justify the excess of skill over experience. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so desperate to achieve results with that mission. He might come from a family on the brink of ruin. Inepto says he must be just a greedy failure. But he couldn't follow that man's orders anymore. While venting, saying he had a mission to fulfill, Encrid told him he talked too much and asked him to attack already, that he wouldn't even need his sword. The noble begins his attack full of rage against his subordinate. In another situation that would be difficult, but he would take advantage of being underestimated. The impulsiveness of that noble is what was driving him to ruin. That blade was approaching Encrid, ready to cut him. But he deflects it with his bare hands. Once his attack was deflected, the noble is immediately surprised. Before he can resume his attack, Encrid strikes him forcefully in the stomach. This blow had been strong enough to make the noble lose his breath. Now he is lying on the ground in agony. The soldiers did not expect everything to be resolved with a single strike, especially not from Encrid, whom they believed to be useless. He turns to the others and announces that the command is now his, asking if there is any opposition. Henry is surprised but says nothing, as does the veteran soldier, who remains silent. The nobleman rises after recovering, disappointed with the outcome of the confrontation. His bodyguard sighs slightly, also disappointed. Finally, in command, Incrid could change the battalion's strategy. As dusk falls, they advance through the dense vegetation. The soldiers are not entirely confident in their new leader. Incrid asks Henry if he has any dreams, but the young man doesn't know why such a specific question was asked. He says he would like to marry a beautiful woman who works with flowers. Incrid tells him that for that to happen, he must survive. He asks the same question to another soldier who has just become a father, and he responds that he must live so his son won't be an orphan. Turning to two others, he hears that one wants to save money and the other to return home. And finally, he asks the thing of Inepto, who only wants to fulfill his mother's wish. His greatest ambition is to restore the greatness of House Gardner. Incrid says the answer for all of them is the same. They need to get out of that place alive. The men listen to him in silence, paying close attention. Now standing before them, he says that all of them will make it out alive. Once they heard that, the platoon is slightly more motivated. Proactivity is a necessity in battle, and there is no greater motivation at that moment than the desire to stay alive because the enemy would appear soon. Incrid orders the archer to fire an arrow in a very specific direction at head height, but the archer says there's nothing there. He tells him he won't repeat himself and orders him to fire the arrow. Obeying, the archer fires the arrow in the commanded direction. The arrow finds its mark in the head of an unsuspecting enemy. The scout squad realizes they were heading into an ambush and that there are enemies nearby. The new leader advances and asks Inepto, known as Andrew, to stay behind him. Now he moves towards the enemies, fueled by the adrenaline of the imminent conflict. This time they will attack with the advantage of initiating combat. Soon, Incrid's sword finds the inside of the first enemy. If they found them first, they would be the ambushers, not the ambushed. One of the enemies doesn't understand how this is happening to them and signals for them to react to the attack. As soon as he speaks, he is coldly executed by Andrew. They needed to use the initial confusion to eliminate as many as possible. With Andrew on the front line, the bodyguard turns and decapitates one who was about to attack the nobleman. They continue the precise attack, increasing their chances of success. The 12 enemies have now been reduced to just 8. Amidst the attack, the enemies shout that they were ambushed and wonder how many there are. It doesn't take long for the rest of the soldiers to join the offensive. Incrid is now categorical in his order. His men should eliminate everyone still breathing. His cold gaze is focused on the enemy platoon. His soldiers advance relentlessly, taking down anyone in their path. The vegetation prevents them from being easily located, and they were only spotted the first time because of one detail. The large feline appeared once again, startling an enemy soldier. It passed by amidst the battle. Incrid was already moving toward the animal to attack the one frightened by it. Before he could do anything to the feline, Incrid eliminates him with his blade. Remembering what happened, Incrid supposes they were hunting that animal. It was the pursuit of that animal that caused them to be discovered. Coincidentally, the ambush on the animal turned into an ambush on the scout group. Since they were focused on the hunt, the coincidence didn't happen this time, and it's thanks to this that they could mount a counteroffensive. Henry announces that they have finally managed to exterminate the enemies who were there, completely ignoring the feline. Incrid urges his men to move on so as not to waste any more time. The beast watches as they move away from that place. Even though they were prepared, the attack cost them one casualty. Preparation doesn't save everyone, but it prevents bad luck from prevailing, and they continue to advance. Not far away, there is a spearman standing guard. Incrid quickly executes him. Because of the repetition of events, he knows the position of all of them as well as the number of soldiers. He changes the direction of the advance to avoid running into 30 armed crossbowmen. His priority is to eliminate the spearmen there because if they regroup, it will greatly hinder the mission's progress. They avoided being ambushed through lightning-fast and brutal attacks. The bodyguard is concerned about Andrew, who is getting too excited, as well as the approaching night, which will make it difficult for them to leave the plane. They needed to return while the sun still illuminated the path. Contrary to the soldiers' suggestion, Incrid says they will continue to advance because they are on the right track. However, the soldier still doubts. He said he wouldn't tolerate disobedience and ordered them to follow. Something happens that leaves the soldiers perplexed. That veteran soldier pointed his blade at the squad leader, suggesting to his captain that he think carefully. He doesn't want to walk into death and will find a way to get out of there alive, even if it means eliminating his leader. Incrid tells him that, of all people, he should already know there's no turning back. After all the commotion, the way back must already be filled with enemies, but the soldier still refuses to follow. Incrid grabs his hand and says he's going to make something very clear now. Just like everyone else there, he wants to get out of that place alive. Andrew thinks to himself that he had assumed this guy would be just another useless generic person, like the father he had, who led the family to ruin by spending everything he had and abandoning everything he owned. But that afternoon had shown that the truth is different from the rumors. This even makes him remember his bedridden mother. Her wish was that the young man would become someone capable of leading people just by being present, that he would earn the trust of others and become a true leader, thus rebuilding his family. That is the kind of person he has always wanted to be. Incrid asks them to trust him, that they will get out of there alive. He's a man who paves the way, and Andrew says he will follow him. Despite everything, this was a reaction Incrid expected. The young man's bodyguard becomes worried, but Andrew says that the captain is now Incrid, not him or anyone else. And since they belong to the squad, it is up to them to obey his orders. The bodyguard remains silent in response to the young man's stance. With the conflict resolved, Incrid ordered them to follow him crouched and without making noise. The soldiers follow him, advancing in hostile and unknown terrain. The first stage of that day was to ambush the enemy and break their siege. Now they were heading into the second stage of that day. They move hidden under the vegetation, progressing slowly. A soldier advances across the plain covered by grass. Countless spear tips emerge across the plain. Now they were at the critical point they encountered after so many repetitions. The soldiers watched their surroundings. It was only at that time and place. Progressing through the terrain, they continued to gain positions. Hidden by the vegetation, they approached their enemies. This allowed them to let the rest of the enemies pass without a direct confrontation. His soldiers are apprehensive as they have already realized the delicacy of the situation. Incrid remains focused on the moment because they cannot afford to be careless. With a little more distance from the enemies, they continue progressing through the vegetation. They all move crouched, making as little noise as possible. Even though the situation is delicate, it proceeds as planned. With the onset of night, the final step of that day begins. There was a reason that made escaping from that field impossible, and Incrid tells his men that they have arrived. Henry can't believe it, and one of the soldiers starts lamenting everything they've been through to get there. In front of them was the enemy camp. Aspen's soldiers defend the field with zeal because there is something there they want to keep secret and protected. The banner flutters in the middle of the clearing where the enemy camp is. The flag, though worn, is still raised. It was a bit morbid, as there were many bones around it. Incrid is curious to know what can happen when capturing enemies is not the most important part of the day, and orders his men to advance. Entering the clearing, he believes a way to escape from there will present itself. One of them asks if the captain intends to set the place on fire. The bodyguard says he's crazy and that the greater chance is that they'll be captured, and Incrid finally asks for his name. He said his name was Mac. Referring to him, he warned that he would not tolerate disobedience. Mac gets irritated, but Andrew asks him to calm down. And the noble follows the captain towards the objective he had set. That experienced soldier worried about the impossibility of returning under the moonlight, which was covered by clouds. The situation demanded full confidence in the leader, who was now slashing one of the tents with his blade. Mac becomes even more apprehensive, seeing that the tent had been cut open. But its interior was empty, with no enemy inside. The progression continues, and Mac is already wondering how they are getting so lucky. Surely Incrid was being reckless by advancing into the enemy camp. However, everything was happening with great fluidity. There wasn't a single enemy there, and there's no doubt that this is their camp. Mac just wants to know how this is even possible. The captain signals to his team they must hold their position now. He tells them to wait there. He had invaded that camp before, and as soon as he tried to touch the flag, he was intercepted by the enemies and was pierced by spears. He explained that the objective of Aspen's soldiers is to protect that flag at all costs. His curiosity lies in imagining what they would do if it caught fire. Mac doesn't know how the captain knows all these things. It is at this moment that something catches his attention. It was the company commander who selected him for this mission, and perhaps she knows something about him. Incrid says that the soldiers are too distracted defending the flag. Now Mac imagines that the assumption of command by him, as well as the infiltration into the camp, was a secret mission assigned to him. The captain says that as soon as the fire starts, it will use the opportunity to begin their escape. It will now split into two groups. One will serve as a distraction while the other sets the place on fire. Mac is resolute now and volunteers to belong to the distraction group that will act as bait. Incrid did not expect this sudden decision from him. The sudden cooperation is unexpected, but it works in his favor. It's not the first time he has led his squad there, but it's the first time he's done so with so many still alive. Andrew also volunteers for the mission. This is the best day so far, and an optimism is in the air. He believes that this time he will succeed. A stone hits the helmet of a foolhardy soldier. Mac runs towards the vegetation while a guard alerts the camp that there are intruders. A number of them move to pursue the distraction group. Incrid seizes the opportunity and approaches the nearest fire source. He's going to make it. He finally reaches the torch with his hand. With it in his possession, he is not just heading toward his objective, but toward tomorrow. Beside him is a soldier ready to strike. That blade begins to descend rapidly towards the captain, but doesn't hit him. Instead, it cuts the torch's handle. Incrid is more surprised than usual because he hadn't heard any sign of that man approaching him. The fire is on the ground, and the captain prepares to engage in combat with the man. This combatant is not someone he has encountered in any of the previous attempts. Incrid just wishes he knew where someone so well prepared came from. The warrior was determined to protect the camp and prepares to attack. Incrid says they are late. Apparently, this phrase caused the warrior to be momentarily distracted. The adjacent tents were already ablaze, and shouts about the fire began. Desperate movement began as the fire spread rapidly. Meanwhile, more soldiers gave warnings about the intruders who were now appearing in large numbers in the camp. The new warrior orders that the priority be to extinguish the fire. Mac had initiated the distraction and Andrew had started the fire. All that remained now was to escape from that dangerous place. Assuming an offensive stance, Incrid prepares to finish off his enemy. Every attack begins with the correct foot positioning and Incrid's blade is already heading towards its target. He had gained enough momentum with his feet. His objective is clear, and he can see the opening in his enemy's defense. The blade is almost reaching its destination. The warrior, however, is endowed with good reflexes, and his eyes begin to track the attack. Incrid remains determined to resolve everything with a simple, well-planned thrust. Nevertheless, the well-prepared warrior steps out of the blade's path. Dodging it apparently didn't take much effort from him. He didn't even raise his own sword. The captain hadn't expected such a well-executed reaction, and even though he hadn't seen any movement from the sword, he had been cut. He had executed a perfect strike that not only missed but also exposed him to a counterattack. He looks at the warrior preparing to rise. The warrior already wielded his sword to finish the job while calling him weak. The captain knows that given the circumstances, he wouldn't be able to defeat him. With all the repetitions, he had barely managed to get there. Countless times he had been ambushed in the field. There were many times when he perished before finally making it to this point. He thought he had overcome all the difficulties up to that point, but then there was that person. That warrior was a singular and dense wall that prevented him from winning the day. Understanding the extent of his wound, he knows that a direct confrontation is useless and offers no chance of victory. Needing to return once again to the beginning of the day and execute everything until that moment once more. Facing the imminent death of his opponent, the warrior is surprised by what he sees. Angrily, he asks if that young man was smiling. Indeed, he was. For now, there was only one thing motivating Incrid: defeating that man. His enemy advances once more, saying that he will turn him into dog food. The captain prepares to defend against that attack. Gripping his sword with both hands, he is determined to overcome that barrier. The swords clash violently, and they clash a second time, causing sparks to fly from their contact. His attack had been effectively blocked. That giant was now preparing to deliver a deadly vertical strike. Incrid could only dodge such a devastating attack. The giant's strength is only surpassed by his speed, as he already delivers another strike from an unfavorable position. His blade is now about to intercept the captain's face, but Incrid manages to defend himself just moments before his head is split. Every movement executed by the warrior is swift and precise. His ferocity in attacking is so great that there is no room for a counterattack. There is a vast gap in skill and physical preparation between them. Taking advantage of the distance, Incrid throws a dagger at his adversary. It is on its way to striking him. However, the young man deflects the blade's trajectory with the back of one hand. Even Incrid couldn't believe what had just happened. That warrior was approaching once again, determined to end the fight. His thrust is close to Incrid's chest. The shouts about the fire grow louder and louder. The blade barely misses piercing the captain's skull. The fire had spread so much that containing it was nearly impossible. There was oil everywhere. The flag that should have been protected now fluttered amidst the flames that consumed it. A soldier calls for the platoon commander, who was the one engaged in combat with Incrid. He tells him that there is much more at stake now. He knows that his enemy, even if wounded, will not surrender and will only give up the fight when he is no longer alive. Incrid stands ready to continue the battle. At that moment, he addresses the one he was fighting. He bids farewell, stating that they will meet again another time. Turning his back on him, he abandons the fight. Incrid finally realizes that his enemy was retreating of his own accord. Now he's wondering if this was truly the wall preventing him from living another day. For if it wasn't him, there is still something left to overcome. Clenching the hilt of his sword firmly, he realizes that he still has a lot to improve. His eyes are filled with determination. Andrew had arrived at the scene and was calling for the captain. He said they needed to leave as soon as possible. Incrid was still focused on the knight he had been fighting, and Andrew called out to him again. He had been completely ignored by the knight, who decided to look back once more. The captain still looks at him as if he wanted to resolve the matter, but he swallows his pride and sheathes his sword. Coming to his senses, he orders all his men to leave the place as quickly as possible. In the camp, those who were alive were struggling to contain the fire that had spread. As the fire grew, the scout platoon began their escape and return home. Incrid realizes that now only 5 members of his original platoon remain with him. One of them is worried that even with the fire, they might be pursued by a large group of enemies. Incrid confidently replies that this is highly unlikely. The archer was coughing and had one arm injured. Some soldiers wandering around decided to follow them and prevent their escape. Before they could reach the wounded archer, Mac charges at them like a beast, along with the others. That small number of enemies begins to be overpowered. The energetic scout squad was taking them down with ease. Every strike they executed was another casualty on the enemy side. Incrid warns once again not to stop and to keep fleeing. The archer says that if they go through the fox habitat, they won't be easily followed, and one of them mentions that it would also complicate their escape. However, the archer says he knows a safe route, one that only hunters know. Incrid decides to trust his subordinate and asks him to lead them from there on. As night had already fallen, the surroundings became increasingly darker the farther they got from the fire, and the footsteps of the pursuers could already be heard. Those scouts continue to march towards the base. Their progress is steady and uninterrupted. There was great merit in the effort exerted by Mac and Andrew in securing victory that day. Likewise, Henry's knowledge was crucial in ensuring they returned safely. Their combined efforts kept them alive. After a long march, the sun begins to rise on the horizon. The growing light blinds the eyes of those who had marched through the darkness. Even though the day is dawn, there is no room for rest, and the platoon continues to march. Back at the camp, a soldier asks what happened to them. They are completely exhausted, on the verge of collapsing. Encrid is dehydrated and tired, but finally a new day has dawned in his life. It was the beginning of something new. Another stage had been left behind. In the enemy camp, the fire was devastating, consuming the banner that was supposed to be protected. Now they needed to prepare another flag. The priest reprimands the company commander, who was unable to stop a few months. That camp was made up of the best men of the Grey Dog Company, and yet a small group managed to infiltrate, start a fire, and escape. Grey Dog is an independent company, even in its operational control. Its name derives from the wolf that lives in the Principality of Aspen, with an intense temperament and a need to connect with its target, whether in love or war. Its soldiers are also called persistent lovers. The commander asks his warrior if his enemy was strong. Mitch says that if it hadn't been for the hindrance of the fire, he would have killed him. The commander acknowledges the man's luck, which in itself is already a skill. Mitch is adamant that it won't happen again. Encrid is in a tent that resembles an infirmary sitting. He is deep in thought because he faced an enemy he could not defeat. He wished he could have continued the fight and knows that they will meet again soon. The same is felt by Mitch, who now wants to finish him off as a personal goal. The same thought rests in Encrid's mind. The Grey Dogs have a new target. The barbarian is sinking into boredom and is worried because he hasn't heard any news of his leader. He holds his axe, which he was tossing into the air. Sitting on his bed, he begins to ponder the possibilities. His greatest fear is that his leader may have perished on the mission. It wouldn't be unexpected. Even though he has made significant progress, what surprises him is that he had already started to like him. If he really did perish, there's nothing that can be done. Blondie has just woken up and lets out a long yawn. The first scene of his day is the barbarian, who was on the bed in front of him. They briefly exchange glances as they were facing each other. Blondie asks what the barbarian was staring at. He doesn't bother to respond and instead raises his middle finger at him. Blondie does the same with his toe. That friendly provocation finally escalates to a truculent level. The barbarian now thinks that maybe he wants to take out Blondie on that beautiful morning. Blondie, unfazed, also draws his sword. In the fairy's tent, she asks if he really ambushed enemies, identified a camp, and set it on fire. Encrid says he made a series of good decisions and that he just got lucky. She observes him, slightly incredulous at his luck, but she tells him to rest and dismisses him from her presence. She had expected something, but she never imagined it would be something like this. The fairy wants to know more about the one who always seems to have luck on his side. On the other hand, Encrid can't even begin to guess what she's thinking, and as soon as he leaves the tent, he is called by Andrew. He formally apologizes to him and says that he is alive only because of the captain's actions. He wonders if they will meet again, to which Encrid says yes, if their paths cross once more. The soldiers watch as the man walks away. What remains with them is admiration and respect forged in the fires of hell. Behind Encrid is a bowed nobleman, a gesture repeated by all those who were with him when enemy ground. Indeed, they are all alive thanks to him, but he only managed to bring back 4. His doubt is whether his best is limited to losing a few in the process. If he were better, he wouldn't have lost 2 of his men. The repetition makes him constantly improve, and eventually, he imagines this will come to an end. He will continue with his goal of becoming a knight, and the days of his life are steps to be climbed. Becoming stronger is the only option left to him. A commotion spreads through the camp saying that the brutes are already practicing their brutish behavior. The barbarian and Blondie were engaged in their 2 minutes of roughhousing without losing their friendship, not that they had any. The barbarian couldn't be happier, and neither could Blondie's psychopathy. Encrid, who observes them, had never seen that expression on their faces, even though they had trained together a few times. The bystanders comment that those 2 have no humanity, they are animals. For Encrid, the obvious conclusion is that during training, he was never a challenge for them. Placing his hand on his sword, he begins to establish his priorities. His goal now was to make them fight against him with that same intensity. The blades clash fiercely, creating sparks with each impact. Blondie notices with his peripheral vision that his leader is there. The barbarian also spots him and says that the leader should let them know when he arrives at the camp. The barbarian shoos away the curious onlookers as soon as the fight ends, while Blondie inquires about his captain's injuries, which Encrid downplays. He wants to know about the attack he blocked from Ragna, but Rem interrupts, saying that the nonsense has started and suggests that he should rest. Then he asks Ragna about the attack he delivered. Ragna asks if he really wants to talk about that now. The captain returns the question with a simple why. Ragna tries to change the subject, but Encrid knows he has something to say. However, he will let the soldier speak when he's ready. As soon as the commander learned of what happened, he moved the entire camp closer to the tall grass plains. During the journey, Encrid's wounds healed well while he reflected on his abilities. Red Hair asks if the captain is going to train because he should be resting, but Encrid says he's just going for a walk. Rem says that if he keeps this up without fully recovering, he'll he'll end up in heaven. The sun's rays break through the sky, illuminating everything. Ragnar wakes up to the sound of a whistling noise. He imagines that the squad leader is already training again. He stretches slowly in his bed. As he gets up, he grabs his sword. He knows that with a sword, he is very skilled. It wasn't hard to become stronger, and he eventually became a knight. Even so, all of it felt somewhat boring. There was nothing he wanted with it, and he didn't even know why he kept at it. He had stalled in life, losing his purpose. In front of him, the captain is training, executing some movements. During the exercise, he felt pain in his wound and had to abort the movement. He bent down to relieve some of what he was feeling. He places his hands on the injury and regains some of his breath. Ragnar identifies that the captain had learned the basics all wrong, and it's important to learn correctly from the start. With such a gap, it would be difficult to become stronger, even if he trained. Even so, it was interesting to observe him. There was a lot of determination in those eyes. Ragnar wondered why the captain was so committed to it. He continues training there in front of him. Ragnar decides to ask what motivates Incrid to keep training. He says his goal is to improve. Then he asks what he would do once he got stronger, and Incrid says he will become a knight. For Ragnar, a knight is just someone who fights very well, and he didn't expect that to be so important to his captain. The captain says that the knight he wants to become is one who wields the sword for what he decides is right, for his own honor and no one else's, to defend the poor, the sick, and especially those he loves. Honor and merit are things that make Ragnar reflect briefly. But indeed, strength is just a tool, not an end. Ragnar also wants to discover what he truly wants, as a knight is just a sword, and he'll only find that out by following his own path. So he calls out to his leader, who hears his soldier calling him. He had a proposal for him, and wanted to know if he was interested in learning how to wield a sword. His response could be no other. He was more than interested in learning it. They exchanged glances after that invitation. Ragnar, just imagining it, is already overcome with a great sense of laziness. But he had already made the offer, and he takes a better look at his captain. That determined gaze could make things interesting. He asked if the barbarian had taught him about the heart of the beast and began talking about his thrust. There are two things he should never forget. Incrid wonders if the sword technique of Valen's mercenaries could be forgotten, to which Ragnar says that it's the first thing that should go down the drain. He needs to abandon it to avoid reverting to old habits, and if that happens, it would be better not to start at all. He was to choose whether to start from scratch or remain stuck in the sameness of his life. His response was quick. He wanted to start from scratch. The response impressed Ragnar, who didn't expect that in a way. He asked if he was really serious about that. However, Incrid already wants to know where he should start training. Now Ragnar is sure that this person is anything but ordinary. Since he is strong, he doesn't need to wield a light sword, and he offered his longsword for him to use. He said there was no problem using his sword and instructed him to place his right hand above the other. He asked why he held the sword so firmly, and the captain replied it was to avoid losing it. He then wanted to know who taught him that and found out it was Rem. Ragnar cursed him, calling him a useless primate. He ordered him to assume the position. As soon as he did, Ragnar greeted him with a direct attack. Incrid managed to defend himself using the longsword. His hands immediately began to tremble. He asked what that was and why it hurt him, to which Ragnar replied that it was an expected outcome. Those who become too rigid end up breaking, and he compared him to a column. Incrid wondered why all the members of his squad expressed themselves so poorly because he didn't understand the comparison. He imagined that exerting too much force made him static, concluding that he should be more flexible to avoid breaking. Thinking this, he held the sword with moderate force. The swords clashed several times under the sunlight. Ragnar managed to unbalance him with a kick. He told him to pay attention to where he pointed his feet. Striking the sword once more, he said that Incrid remained too rigid and that his hip would feel that impact. He asked if he was fighting or dancing. Their training continued. Time passed, and Incrid was on the ground with Ragnar standing before him. He never imagined that the captain would be so bad, barely knowing the basics. It was so obvious that it was hard to teach someone. However, Incrid got up once again to continue training. He took the sword in his hand. Ragnar looked at him, very intrigued. His thoughts about the situation didn't stop, and he observed the captain seriously. Incrid wanted them to try once more. A bit reluctant, Ragnar took a guard position with his sword. He suggested they go a bit more slowly this time. Rem arrived and said he had been wondering where the two had been all day. He imagined that the pair had been on a picnic in the forest. He asked if Ragnar was bothering him. If so, he would take care of it, and Blondie said he would rip his hands off. Incrid asked if something had happened for him to be dressed. Rem said they had been summoned. Enemy forces were gathering on the horizon. Everyone was beginning preparations for an imminent battle. The entire army was assembled, ready to react to any hostile action. Incrid's group was with them. Ragnar thought he had made a mistake trying to teach his captain since he wasn't familiar with the technique. That might prevent him from surviving beyond today. To prevent that, the captain would need a babysitter. All Incrid wanted was to learn more about that technique. In front of them was the enemy banner with incinerated flags. What they initially noticed was that the enemy formation was strange. In the opposing army, the caparatistic priests declared that they would now witness the end of everything. A large and intense fog began to engulf their position. The commander realized that this was the result of magic. The soldiers were soon enveloped by the mist, preventing them from having a wide field of vision. Incrid was surprised that it appeared so suddenly. He couldn't even see who was beside him. The fog continued to thicken. Complaints spread among the soldiers who saw nothing and didn't know why the fog had appeared. Immediately, Incrid went into a state of alert. Things began to happen, and the soldiers wondered if they were really happening. They didn't know what was going on, and soon some began to panic. Incrid shouted as loudly as he could. What was approaching them was a large cloud of arrows. An unfathomable number of them began to fall from the sky, piercing through the fog. The army began to be hit without having time to react. The fairy defended herself against the arrows, thinking that the fog was certainly the work of magic. She didn't expect such a tactic. She ordered her army to use shields for protection, but thought they had already lost the battle. Meanwhile, the caparatistic priest laughed at the situation. It was very difficult to perform that magic. He had to use Kruka blood and dwarf distillery Kachava, which was a painstaking effort. As soon as it was invoked, the field of vision was impaired, and unless they were behind the flags, the battle was already over. He had named the technique Bikrara's Fog. Mitch noticed that the priest was pleased, and indeed he was, because it was almost impossible to perform with a banner in that situation. Had it not been for that, the magic would have been even more effective. Mitch grew furious as he remembered that the banner had nearly been incinerated completely by the one he encountered in the camp. In the fog, Incrid tried to avoid the arrows as best he could. The arrows continued to fall from the sky like deadly raindrops. Incrid noticed that one of them passed dangerously close to him. Someone shouted for him to keep a low profile. It was Ragna behind him giving that advice. Another voice said that it was sorcery, the work of unscrupulous people, and that voice belonged to Rem. Even though Rem was in front of him, Incrid couldn't see him. It was impossible to fight like that. An arrow fell this time near his leg. His breathing was becoming increasingly heavy, and his entire body was growing tenser. His legs also felt very heavy, preventing him from putting into practice what he had learned from Ragna, since he didn't expect to learn it perfectly the first time. Ragna had warned him that he would revert to old habits, and that if he didn't fully grasp something new, it was better not to fight at all. And unless he fought on the battlefield, he would end up perishing. That made sense, and it was his answer. Death wasn't something he feared. Amid the sounds of clashing armor, Incrid advanced through the battlefield. Ragna urged him not to stray and to stay behind him, but his captain already had an idea. He moved toward the heat of the battle, causing Ragna to shout in despair. A spear began to emerge through the mist. It pierced Incrid's throat as if it were made of paper. His neck bore a fatal wound, and that was his passage. It was his passage back to learn more from Ragna. The soldier who stabbed him stared at the sadistic smile of his victim. He withdrew his spear from the lifeless body, pushing it away with one of his feet. Daybreak came once more at the camp. Ragna asked if he had understood, but the truth was that he lacked an interesting teaching method because he was a genius and everything was obvious to him. He knew of his limitation but continued asking his captain to perform a simple movement that he kept executing poorly. This wasn't a joke. Ragna was genuinely confused, and Incrid asked where his center of gravity should be. However, Ragna didn't understand the question directed at him. He tried to replicate the stance statically, but it didn't help. He didn't know how to explain what he did. Even though the explanation was vague, observing and repeating was a quality of Incrid, who intended to replicate Ragna's stance. Arrows pierced the fog once again like raindrops. Incrid defended against them using his sword. He felt his hands tremble. He was still too rigid in his stance. A spear tip emerged once more. It struck him mortally, but he could continue learning and progressing. Ragna advanced with precise and flexible attacks. Incrid dodged a precise thrust. After 31 days, his movement had improved, and Ragna praised him, saying that step was very good and asked where he had learned it. Finally, he was ready to start learning the basics. Basic attacks include slashing, thrusting, and slicing. The tip of the sword is used for defense, but if the sword is good, the sides can also serve that purpose. Within the attack range, the smallest one is called the attack line. Combat is nothing more than avoiding the opponent's line while extending your own. You just need to visualize the opponent in your mind and reach them with the sword. That spear emerged once again through the fog. This time it didn't find Incrid. He felt his feet were lighter and dodging was easier this time. He soon faced a massive barrage of spears. Being pierced multiple times, the end of the day was slowly changing. His training with Ragna continued to progress. At one point, Ragna thought Incrid had predicted his strike because he parried his sword perfectly. Even though he continued to perish, things were slowly changing. Meanwhile, he was perfecting the basic sword attacks. Ragna said that the diagonal strike no longer needed repetition. In the fog, Ragna remained worried about his captain's indiscriminate advance into combat because he was pierced by multiple spears. Once again, he was eliminated, but his learning progress remained constant. Ragna delivered a powerful vertical strike. Incrid managed to react to it with mastery. Now it was his turn to deliver a strike toward his unusual teacher, deflecting the sword with precision and technique even if it didn't surprise him. After 100 days of repetition, Ragna was impressed. His eyes were focused on the person in front of him, because this was not the same person he once knew. Incrid had changed drastically after all those days of training. The way Ragna looked at him was no longer the same. This young man never imagined it was possible to evolve so much with such an absurd ability. Ragnar continued to worry about him amid the fog. He ran desperately toward his captain's position, but Encrid easily dodged the spear that once would have ended his life because he was no longer at the level he once was. That spear passed very close to his face. Encrid continued advancing through the battlefield with a single goal in mind. This was the path he needed to tread to become a knight. Even though the fog was dense, he could see several enemies ahead of him. It didn't take long before his body was pierced multiple times once again. Even though it hurt, the pain was fleeting for him. Repeating that day was becoming so enjoyable that it might compromise his sanity. Ragnar stood before his captain in the camp. He asked if he was still interested in learning the art of the sword. Encrid only desired to become stronger and stronger. He responded with determination that he was knowing he would die as many times as necessary to grow stronger. Ragnar was intrigued by his captain's ability. He asked if he had been fighting awkwardly on purpose until now because his base was surprisingly solid. All he lacked now was experience. That same barrage of arrows pierced the fog once again. It was now the 200th time Encrid had gone through that day. His foundation was perfectly honed. Dodging the arrows now didn't require much effort. He continued advancing toward the battle. His curiosity now was to see how far he could advance that day using what he had learned. The spear that had claimed his life so many times no longer found him. Its wielder was decapitated without even understanding what had happened. His head flew through the air like a balloon. Encrid knew where and how his enemies would appear. This knowledge made it even easier to eliminate some of them, even though he couldn't see them. An enemy soldier was terrified of what was happening around him. The surprising thing was that there was nothing in front of him. The soldier was confused by his senses, but he didn't have time for that because he was already missing one of his feet claimed by Encrid. Desperate screams echoed through the fog, terrifying other combatants. One of them told the others to be careful with the ground, and a crossbowman pointed his weapon at the soil. Ragnar had drilled into him to remember eyes, feet, and hands. The eyes were used to anticipate things. The feet were for movement. They stepped on the ground in perfect harmony with the technique. His blade found the soldier, piercing him without encountering resistance. The hands were for finishing the attack. Encrid smiled with joy because now it was different. Fighting was now different because he had finally mastered the principles of the sword. In the midst of the fog, he was unleashed like a beast that hadn't fed for a long time. He eagerly awaited his enemies to come to him. In front of him were several soldiers armed with crossbows. The soldier said he had advanced well, but his life had met an inevitable end. Encrid now stood pensively before his enemies because there was only one thing he wanted. He suggested to those in front of him that they fight with swords. Like real men, after all, the only thing he wanted was to keep testing himself more and more. The suggestion was poorly received by the soldier, who correctly guessed he was dealing with a madman. He was pierced repeatedly as the arrows were fired without any pause. In a void outside of time, a drop of water fell into what seemed to be an endless ocean. A voice called Encrid a fool for having walked to his own end. Most likely, he had lost his sanity after all that repetition of suffering. After that time, Encrid woke up lying in his bed. He didn't understand why the entity had appeared that time if it was only to insult him. Someone asked what he was doing and if he was lost in daydreams. The one with him in the tent was Rem. The fog thickened, and Encrid realized the moment the spell was activated. From a strategic point of view, the enemy formation lacked cohesion, as if they were protecting the banner. The question was why. So he asked Rem if he had any knowledge about spells. The question was unexpected, but the captain said he would like to know what Rem knew about the subject. So he begins with the basics, asking if Rem knows the difference between magic and sorcery. Encrid imagines that magic is more common, but Rem says that his assumption isn't incorrect. To perform a sorcery, a medium is needed, and the medium is the most crucial part of the spell. Without its presence, a sorcery cannot be performed. So that's it, Encrid thinks. The enemy's sorcery is the fog, and the banner must be its medium. By destroying the banner, the fog would disappear. He then asked if there are any sorcerers in Rem's tribe since they are from the west and sorcery comes from the west. Rem said he had seen some, but there aren't many sorcerers. Most of them are actually witches. Encrid leaves his tent and Rem asks where he's going. There was only one answer. He was going to train. Ragnar says that his captain seems to have had the same basic training as him. He asks if he knows anything about a sword technique called oniak. Half a century ago, a prodigy was born, and as a child he killed 12 bandits who were attacking the farm where he lived using a fire poker. Being orphaned, he learned the art of the sword early and was adopted by a noble who had heard the rumors. His name was Leonis Oniak. His blessing also carried a curse. He began to lose strength at the age of 10, becoming completely paralyzed by 12. His legend was lost and he returned to it at 20, compiling sword techniques into 5 categories. The just sword, the strong sword, the fluid sword, the fast sword, and the gentle sword. He rewrote his story, making the house of Oniak the greatest in the empire, and to this day, these techniques influence modern swordsmanship. Ragnar says that his technique has roots in the heavy sword of the north. The consciousness of the beast, or its heart, is an interesting concept. Focus on a single point, concentrate solely on the sword and its enemies, nothing else. He was going to demonstrate to his captain how it works in practice. Incrid was immediately surprised by what he saw. The thrust passed close to his face, close enough to make a superficial cut on his neck. That strike was faster than Rem's axe, and he almost met his end with it. Ragnar asked if he felt anything. Rem arrived at that moment and began hurling curses at Ragnar, asking if what he wanted was to eliminate the squad leader. Ragnar said that concentration is better when on the brink of death. Rem said that he wouldn't learn anything without his head. They began to argue, and they loved to do, but Incrid was certain that both lacked the teaching skills needed to instruct. Rem said that Blondie is from the far north and that his people are more barbaric than anything else. In response, Ragnar said that Rem is from the barbarian tribes of the south. They began to think about fighting, but Incrid didn't allow it and asked if Rem had come to inform him of the withdrawal order. Ragnar told him to remember the state of alertness that arises in the face of imminent death. If he succeeded in meditating on a single point, everything else would disappear, and he would realize that his sword would take care of the rest. The enemy army was gathered once again. Incrid noticed a similarity between this and the heart of the beast that he had learned from Rem. But instead of losing himself in the face of death, this technique made him even more alert. What he lacked now was the experience to understand how it worked. More than that, he needed to focus on the banner that kept the spell active on the battlefield. Destroying that banner was the key to ending the inevitable carnage. The fog emerged once again, confusing the soldiers. Now there was an objective above gaining experience. He was determined to destroy the banner at any cost. With Rem and Ragnar by his side, reaching it wouldn't be a great challenge. His sword continued slicing through enemies, and his thrusts were extremely precise. The swing of his sword sprayed blood across the battlefield. He was determined to try this until he could no longer. Focusing on a single point was very useful because he had perished many times when he was unprepared. During the Assassin's event, he trained his ears. To survive on the battlefield, he learned the heart of the beast. But focusing on a single point was different. Ragnar pointed his sword at his captain's face, asking if he understood. If he managed it, he would feel the tip of the blade as if time were slowing down or something similar. At first, he didn't understand and wondered if it was the boldness of the heart of the beast interfering, but he didn't think it was that. He must forget his surroundings and feel only the sword, and with that, he should be able to predict where it will be. Perhaps channeling the fear of death isn't the ideal approach for him. So he asked Ragnar how he learned to do this. Ragnar replied that he never really learned it. He always knew how to do it. Incrid asks if he's serious about that claim. It's in the name of the technique. You need to concentrate on a single point, Ragnar explained. But his answers weren't helpful. Incrid would need to discover it on his own. He just couldn't afford to be impatient. He would keep practicing. But his priority was still to destroy the banner. Minimizing his allies' losses and advancing through enemy lines, a fog enveloped the battlefield. Someone shouted loudly for everyone to get down immediately. The soldiers crouched and Incrid ordered them to position their shields, much to Ragnar's surprise. It didn't take long for the arrows to start penetrating the fog. The shields protected the soldiers from the lethal barrage. This was already the 300th day of repetition. Incrid knew where the attacks would come from, even with his eyes closed. His sword was lethal, and the spearman who had killed him so many times was now as dangerous as an unarmed child. It didn't take long for his blade to claim the spearman's life. His lethality on the battlefield was terrifying. Enemy soldiers panicked, even though it was just one person. They advanced to try to kill him, but it was all in vain. What unfolded was a grand display of dismemberment orchestrated by the enemy soldiers. Incrid's refinement in sword technique was enviable. Terror gripped the soldiers, who lost their formation as they tried to eliminate this frightening presence. However, Incrid was more immersed in the present moment than ever before. No ordinary soldier was capable of standing up to him at that moment. His strikes cut through those men as if delivered by an entity. His advance continued, and there was no obstacle capable of slowing him down. It took him 10 days to finally reach the banner. He finally broke the pole that held it upright. What he didn't expect was what happened next. Even with the banner destroyed, the fog continued to fill the battlefield. His moment of distraction was enough for his body to be pierced by spears. One of the soldiers remarked that he knew a little about sorcery, but was still mistaken. That banner was just a decoy. There was a real one, but it wasn't that one. On the battlefield, several banners could be seen. The question was, which one was the real one? Incrid advanced once again toward the battle, much to Ragnar's despair, who was intent on protecting him. Even the soldiers didn't understand the reason for his impetuous advance, but Incrid knew he had a 1 in 5 chance of getting it right on the next attempt. He advanced fiercely toward the spearmen. Before engaging, he ordered the soldiers to crouch and raise their shields, but they didn't hear well and couldn't see the battlefield. The arrows flew over their heads like a deadly swarm carrying death. Incrid used his shield to defend against those that struck his silhouette. Behind him, several soldiers were struck down by the arrows. This time, he wasn't heard. Perhaps he needed to give them more time to recover and understand him. After 3 more days of repetition, he reached the second banner, which was also a decoy. Once again, he met his end right after destroying the distraction. It took another 5 days to approach the third banner, which was also a decoy. To reach the fourth banner, he needed 7 more days. The result was the same as all the others. Just another distraction. Only 2 banners remained, and given the situation, something relatively obvious stood out. Incrid observed the battlefield and the position of the banners. The two that remained were both distant and well protected. The most distant one fluttered in the wind. Given the recent events, the true banner was almost certainly the one furthest from danger. The soldiers were once again blinded by the fog. Incrid ordered them to crouch immediately. Once they did, he ordered the shields to be positioned for defense. As soon as his command was given, the arrows began to appear in the sky. They advanced across the battlefield, and Incrid asked Rem to follow him. Rem retorted, thinking that his leader must be crazy. The banner was far away, and he couldn't afford to tire himself before reaching its position. Rem struck down a soldier with his axe, clearing the way for his captain. That distraction allowed Incrid to press forward. Rem interrogated one of the dying soldiers, trying to find out who had conjured that spell. After finishing him off, he hoped the next would provide the information he sought. The enemy screamed in terror as that being was more beast than man. Meanwhile, Incrid continued to advance. After nearly a year, Incrid finally found himself close to the banner he presumed to be the correct one. His sword was in hand, and he believed that this would be the end of that day. He struck the mass, expecting to dispel the fog once and for all. However, his blade was intercepted by another sword. His strike was effectively parried by the very man he had dueled with during the invasion of the enemy camp. The man declared that God had heard his prayers. His desire to deal with Incrid personally was genuine. Upon hearing this, Incrid paused and thought for a moment, and finally asked who it was that had stopped him. The commander's ego was wounded, as he had been completely forgotten by the one he had sworn to eliminate with his own hands. He couldn't believe that after just a few days, he had already been forgotten. The truth was that for Incrid, that encounter had happened over a year ago. Incrid truly didn't remember the man standing before him and asked once again who he was. It didn't matter because the man said that he would soon pierce him, and once that happened, Incrid would remember who he was. He advanced toward Incrid, determined to make him remember one way or another. Unlike their last encounter, this time Incrid had felt the blade approaching. He deftly dodged while preparing his counterstrike, surprising the enemy commander. Incrid's feet were perfectly positioned on the ground. Even though he had launched into his thrust, his opponent was skilled enough to avoid contact. He prepared to continue defending himself and realized something had changed. The person in front of him was not the same as the one he had faced days ago. His abilities had improved so much that there was no comparison. He was furious because he had merely been caught by a single lethal move. His defensive stance was correct because Incrid was pressuring him with ease. Their swords clashed once again, and now the commander found himself on the defensive. He noticed in Incrid's attack that he was now using a solid sword technique, one that allowed him to parry attacks effortlessly. But this commander wasn't in his position by chance, and he attempted to overpower his opponent with sheer physical force. However, Incrid deflected the commander's sword as if he weren't even being attacked or pressured. The commander felt that his adversary was entirely focused on what was in front of him, an equilibrium that could be lost with the slightest distraction. Incrid was giving his all in the combat, living in the present moment to the fullest. The same was true for the commander. The type of technique, the banner, everything else faded from his mind. The only thing that existed between them now was the battle. Around them, nothing else existed except for each other. Only their swords reigned in this dimension of combat. The commander was now a whirlwind of attacks. His strikes, like Incrid's, were designed to end the fight with the slightest touch. Faced with this, Incrid realized that he wasn't the only one immersed in the moment of combat. His adversary managed to pierce him with precision. All the effort to destroy the banner had come to an end. His labored cough couldn't hide the extent of the damage he suffered from that single strike. As the commander had said, Incrid finally remembered who had stabbed him. It was the man who had been protecting the camp's banner, and he introduced himself as Lieutenant Mitch. Incrid did the same, stating that he was the squad leader of the Kingdom of Nerelia. Soldiers approached, warning that the enemy was closing in. Mitch remarked that they were good at infiltrating the territory. One of the soldiers noted that the lieutenant seemed a bit disappointed now. Looking at his adversary, Mitch asked what was wrong with him because he was smiling. However, Incrid realized that Ragnar was wrong. It wasn't the fear of death that drove him in battle. What he needed was a worthy opponent with whom he could use everything he had to elevate himself technically. Mitch remarked that perhaps Incrid was just a madman. Finally, he withdrew his sword from Incrid's chest. Incrid found himself back with Ragnar, who was explaining once again how to focus on a single point, comparing it to the feeling of facing death. The captain's generic response made Ragnar wonder if he was really listening or if he was giving up. The barbarian arrived with news that they should join the army. Incrid got up and called for Ragnar to accompany them into battle. Ragnar noticed that his captain seemed more motivated than ever before. He was definitely an odd guy, and perhaps on that day, he would push his body more than usual. That fog appeared once again. The soldiers complained about its sudden emergence and how they could no longer see anything. Someone ordered them to crouch and cover themselves with their shields immediately. Arrows sliced through the fog, piercing the defensive barrier. Incrid advanced once again through the front lines, requesting Rem's help to push further. It was madness, but alongside them was Ragnar. Rem thought Incrid was crazy for following them, to which Ragnar retorted that if Rem didn't want his brain splattered, he should keep his eyes forward. It didn't take long before they encountered a barrage of spearmen. Rem's axes were extremely lethal, just like Ragna's sword. Clearing the path, Incrid once again came face to face with Mitch, who was protecting the true banner on the battlefield. Incrid greeted him amicably, calling him a friend and expressing his desire to duel with him once more. Mitch was surprised as he hadn't expected Incrid to seek him out amid the chaos of the battle. Incrid said he hadn't forgotten him and had been eagerly looking for him. Mitch remarked that this was the first time someone had found him before he found them. Faced with this, his adversary asked if he was disappointed. "Ridiculous," Mitch replied as their swords were about to clash once more. Once again, they became immersed in the moment where only the sword existed, and once again, Incrid met his end at Mitch's blade. Mitch hadn't expected his opponent to fall so quickly. He found him foolish for believing he could win. Incrid's mindset was wrong. He shouldn't force this state of immersion in the blade. The immersion in the sword must happen naturally with the flow of battle. By repeating that duel, he would find the way it happens. That sensation where only the blades exist and nothing more. It was the 18th time they had faced each other from Incrid's perspective. By the 20th time, he could see clearly and enter that state by his own will. On the 40th encounter, Ragna said he would show him how it happens. Ragna's blade approached his captain's face. Time seemed to slow for him, and his perception of reality shifted. The approach of the sword happened gradually. The gleam in his eyes revealed the blade's advance. Instinctively, Incrid reacted, deflecting his soldier's sword. Ragna was extremely surprised by this. He asked if, in that brief moment, Incrid had deflected his sword by focusing on a single point. If so, Ragna wanted to know how he did it, as pure concentration meant total control between body and sword. Everything in Incrid had been honed thanks to that endless battle. Ragna asked where his captain was going, and Incrid replied clearly that he was going to find the enemy commander. That endless day had finally reached its conclusion. To ensure you don't miss the next part, activate the notification bell and see you next time on Tob's channel.